The ancient books trembled as Morgan Silverblood placed them back on the shelf. Dust particles danced in the late afternoon sunlight that filtered through the bookshop's high windows. The scent of aged leather and parchment filled her nostrils, a familiar comfort in her father's antiquarian bookstore tucked away in the oldest part of Ravenshadow. Morgan brushed a strand of platinum hair away from her face, her fingers leaving a smudge of dust on her cheek. At 30, she had long grown accustomed to the curious glances her unusual hair color attracted. In Ravenshadow, where most residents had dark hair, her silver-blonde locks made her stand out like a beacon in the perpetual mist that surrounded their secluded city. The bell above the shop door jingled, pulling Morgan from her thoughts. She turned to greet the customer, her practiced smile already forming. The man who entered wore an expensive charcoal suit that seemed at odds with his unkempt appearance. His eyes darted around the shop with an intensity that immediately put Morgan on edge. "Welcome to Silverblood Antiquities. Can I help you find something specific?" Morgan's voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who had spent years in customer service, but her right hand instinctively moved to her hip, where, during her military days, a sidearm would have been holstered. The man's eyes snapped to her, and for a moment Morgan felt a chill run through her body. His pupils seemed unnaturally dark, almost as if they absorbed the light around them. "I'm looking for historical texts, specifically anything regarding the founding of Ravenshadow," he said, his voice carrying an accent Morgan couldn't quite place. "Local history is in the back corner," Morgan replied, gesturing toward a dimly lit section of the shop. "Feel free to browse. Some of our rarest volumes aren't on display, but I can check our inventory if you have something particular in mind." The stranger nodded and made his way to the indicated section. Morgan returned to her cataloging, but kept the man in her peripheral vision. Something about him felt wrong. 5 years in the military had honed her instincts for danger, and right now, those instincts were screaming. Her father had left her in charge while he attended a book auction in the neighboring town. "Watch the shop, protect the books," he'd said with his usual gentle smile. The way he emphasized protect had always struck Morgan as odd, as if the dusty tomes contained more than just words and illustrations. A soft thud from the history section snapped Morgan back to the present. The stranger was no longer visible among the stacks. Moving quietly, another skill from her military days, Morgan made her way toward the sound. She found the man hunched over an open book, his back to her, but it wasn't one from the shelves. He had somehow found and opened the concealed drawer in the antique reading desk where her father kept The Chronicles of Shadow and Light, one of the oldest and most valuable books in their collection. "That's not for sale," Morgan said sharply. The man spun around, the ancient book clutched in his hands. His face had changed somehow. The skin around his eyes had darkened, and his pupils had expanded to consume nearly the entire iris. "I wasn't planning to buy it," he replied with a smile that revealed teeth too sharp to be human. Morgan lunged forward, military training taking over. "Put it down, now!" The stranger's smile widened. With unexpected speed, he shoved past her, knocking her into a bookshelf. Volumes tumbled around her as she regained her balance and sprinted after him. The thief was already at the door when Morgan grabbed a heavy brass bookend from the counter and hurled it with precision. It struck his shoulder with a dull thud, causing him to stumble. The ancient book fell from his grasp, landing with its pages splayed across the hardwood floor. When the man turned to face her again, his transformation had progressed further. The darkness around his eyes had spread across his cheeks, and his hands had elongated into claw-like appendages. "You don't know what you're protecting, Silverblood," he hissed, the sound more animal than human. Morgan froze. How did he know her full name? She hadn't introduced herself, and though the shop bore the family name, few people made the connection to her personally. The creature, for she could no longer think of him as a man, snatched up the book and bolted through the door. Morgan grabbed her jacket from behind the counter and gave chase, her combat boots pounding against the cobblestone streets of old Ravenshadow. The mist that perpetually clung to the city had thickened with the approaching evening, transforming familiar streets into an ethereal maze. Morgan followed the dark figure as he darted through narrow alleys and across small courtyards. The few pedestrians they passed turned to stare at the chase, but no one intervened. The creature led her toward the edge of the city, where ancient buildings gave way to the dense forest that surrounded Ravenshadow. The trees loomed ahead, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers through the mist. Morgan hesitated at the tree line. The Ravenshadow forest was not a place to enter lightly, especially as dusk approached. Local legends spoke of strange creatures and lost travelers, but the thief had her father's book, perhaps the most valuable possession in their shop. Taking a deep breath, she plunged into the forest. The temperature dropped immediately, and the mist thickened among the ancient trees. Morgan slowed her pace, moving cautiously now. The sound of her own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the eerie silence of the forest. A movement to her right caught her attention. The creature stood in a small clearing, the book still clutched in his hands. But he was changing more rapidly now. The darkness had spread across his entire face, and his suit seemed to be melting into his skin, forming a pitch-black carapace. "What are you?" Morgan demanded, trying to keep the fear from her voice. "A messenger," the creature replied, its voice now a rasping whisper. "And you are an obstacle that should have been removed long ago." It lunged at her with inhuman speed. Morgan ducked and rolled, a movement that had saved her life more than once during her military service. She came up with a fallen branch in her hand, brandishing it like a staff. The creature circled her, its movements fluid and predatory. "The Shadowcrest Lord will be pleased when I bring him both the book and your head, last daughter of Silverblood." Morgan's grip tightened on the branch. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't," the creature laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "They've kept you ignorant, hidden you in plain sight. But the time of ignorance is ending. The moon ritual approaches, and Lord Shadowcrest will not be denied." It attacked again, claws slashing through the air where Morgan's face had been a second before. She struck back, landing a solid blow against the creature's torso. The branch snapped on impact, leaving her with a splintered stump. The creature seemed unfazed. It tossed the ancient book aside and focused entirely on Morgan. "Your grandmother would have been a more worthy opponent," it taunted. Anger flared in Morgan's chest at the mention of her grandmother Eleanor, who had died when Morgan was just a child. The memory of the kind-eyed woman with the same platinum hair as her own had been a comfort throughout Morgan's life. The creature used her momentary distraction to lunge again. This time, its claws caught Morgan's arm, tearing through her jacket and leaving 3 parallel gashes in her flesh. Pain seared through her, but she managed to deliver a counterattack, driving the splintered end of the branch deep into the creature's shoulder. A horrible shriek erupted from its throat, and black ichor spurted from the wound. The creature staggered backward, clawing at the wood embedded in its body. Morgan pressed her advantage, delivering a powerful kick to its chest. The creature tumbled backward, losing its footing on the uneven forest floor. It fell with another shriek, tumbling down a steep, mist-shrouded embankment that Morgan hadn't noticed in the fading light. The sounds of breaking branches and disturbed earth followed its descent, then silence. Morgan stood at the edge of the drop-off, breathing heavily. Blood trickled down her arm, and her head spun slightly from the exertion and shock. She needed to retrieve the book and get back to the city before full dark. Turning, she spotted the ancient tome where the creature had discarded it. The leather cover gleamed dully in the fading light, seemingly undamaged despite its rough treatment. As Morgan approached, she noticed that the book had fallen open to a page depicting 3 symbols: a wolf's head, a crescent moon, and what appeared to be a shadowy figure. Below the illustrations was text, in an archaic form of writing that Morgan couldn't decipher. But something about the symbols resonated deep within her, like the echo of a forgotten song. A twig snapped behind her. Morgan whirled, anticipating the creature's return, but instead found herself facing a man. Tall and broad-shouldered, he had the weathered look of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. His gray eyes studied her with an intensity that made Morgan take an involuntary step backward. "You're bleeding," he observed, his voice deep and resonant. Morgan glanced down at her wounded arm. "I'll survive." "Perhaps," the stranger replied, "but wounds from a shadow wraith can fester, if not properly treated." He gestured to the forest around them. "This is no place to linger as night falls." "Shadow wraith?" Morgan repeated, her mind racing to process this new information. Is that not what you were fighting? The man took a step closer, and Morgan noticed a slight limp in his gait. Few could stand against such a creature and live to tell about it. Morgan's eyes narrowed. How long were you watching? A hint of a smile touched the man's lips. Long enough to be impressed. Military training? Something like that, Morgan replied cautiously, not wanting to reveal too much to this mysterious observer. The man nodded toward the book in her hands. That's what it was after? Morgan instinctively pulled the tome closer to her chest. It's just an old book from my father's shop. No, the man said, his expression darkening. It's much more than that, and I suspect you know it, even if you don't understand why. A distant howl echoed through the forest, causing both of them to turn toward the sound. The man's face tightened with concern. The Wraith's kin are coming. We need to move. He extended a hand toward Morgan. I can help you get safely back to the city. Morgan hesitated, her training screaming at her not to trust this convenient savior. Who are you? Someone who recognizes the daughter of Silverblood when he sees her. His gray eyes bore into hers. Your hair marks you as clearly as that pendant around your neck. Morgan's hand automatically rose to the silver locket she always wore, a gift from her grandmother. She'd never taken it off, not even during her military service. It bore a small crescent moon engraving that matched the symbol in the book. Another howl sounded, closer this time, followed by several more from different directions. They were being surrounded. The stranger held out his hand again. Trust is a luxury we don't have time for. Come with me if you want to live through the night. Making a split-second decision, Morgan grabbed his outstretched hand. His grip was strong and surprisingly warm in the chill air. This way, he said, leading her deeper into the forest rather than back toward the city. The town is the other direction, Morgan protested. They'll be watching the paths back to Ravenshadow, the man explained without slowing. We need another route. They moved swiftly through the darkening forest, the man seeming to find a path where none was visible to Morgan's eyes. Despite his limp, he moved with the surety of someone intimately familiar with these woods. After several minutes of rapid travel, they came to a small clearing dominated by an enormous oak tree. Its trunk must have been at least 10 feet in diameter, with roots that rose from the ground like massive serpents before plunging back into the earth. The man approached one section where the roots formed a kind of archway. He placed his hand on the bark and murmured words that Morgan couldn't understand. To her astonishment, the wood seemed to shift and part, revealing a hollow space within the massive trunk. Inside, he urged, glancing over his shoulder at the forest behind them. Morgan could now hear rustling in the underbrush. Something was approaching, and fast. She ducked into the opening, and the stranger followed, the wooden door sealing shut behind them. The interior of the tree was surprisingly spacious and illuminated by a soft blue light that seemed to emanate from the wood itself. A simple pallet lay against one wall, alongside a few supplies and what appeared to be weapons wrapped in oiled cloth. "What is this place?" Morgan asked, her voice hushed in the confined space. "A sanctuary," the man replied, moving to examine her wounded arm. "One of many scattered throughout the forest. They're known only to the forest wardens." "And you're a forest warden?" The hint of a smile returned to his face. "Among other things." He took a small container from a shelf and opened it to reveal a salve that smelled of mint and something else Morgan couldn't identify. "This will sting," he warned before applying it to her wounds. The pain was immediate and intense, like liquid fire being poured directly into the cuts. Morgan bit her lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood as her teeth broke the skin. "The venom of a shadow wraith causes corruption if left untreated," the man explained as he worked. "The salve neutralizes it, but the process is unpleasant." "You don't say," Morgan managed through gritted teeth. When he finished, he wrapped her arm in a clean strip of cloth. The burning sensation had already begun to fade, replaced by a cooling numbness. "Thank you," Morgan said, studying her rescuer more carefully now. He appeared to be around 40, with dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. His face bore the lines of someone who had seen much hardship, but there was a nobility in his features that was undeniable. The sounds of pursuit had grown louder outside their sanctuary, inhuman shrieks and growls that made Morgan's skin crawl. "They can't find us here," the man assured her, noting her concern. "The old magic protects us." "Old magic," Morgan repeated flatly. "Shadow wraiths, forest wardens. You realize how this sounds?" "Like madness, I imagine." He settled himself on the floor across from her. "Yet you fought a creature that transformed before your eyes and followed a stranger into a hollow tree that opened at his command." Morgan couldn't argue with that logic. She looked down at the book still clutched in her hands. "That thing, the wraith, it mentioned my grandmother, and a ritual, the moon ritual." The man's expression turned grave. "The ritual of the moon shard. It's performed once every 50 years when the celestial alignment is right. The next one is in 3 days. And what does this ritual do exactly?" "It depends on who performs it. In the right hands, it maintains the balance between the 3 founding powers of Ravenshadow. In the wrong hands—" He trailed off, his gray eyes darkening. "In the wrong hands, it could unleash a darkness that would consume everything." Morgan opened the ancient book to the page with the 3 symbols: the wolf, the moon, and the shadow. "The wolf crest, the silver blood, and the shadow crest," he confirmed. "The 3 original families that founded Ravenshadow a millennium ago." "Silverblood," Morgan said, touching her family name on the page. "That's my name, but we're just booksellers. We're not whatever you're suggesting. Your family has hidden its true nature for generations, ever since the Great Purge." The man leaned forward, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the tree's interior. "But the blood cannot be denied. Have you never wondered why you heal faster than others? Why you feel stronger when the moon is full? Why animals seem drawn to you?" Morgan's mind flashed to moments throughout her life: a broken arm that had mended in half the expected time, inexplicable surges of energy during night operations in the military, the stray cats and dogs that always seemed to find their way to her. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. The man studied her for a long moment before answering. "My name is Griffin Wolfcrest." The name struck Morgan like a physical blow. Everyone in Ravenshadow knew the name Wolfcrest. It belonged to the ruling family that had governed the isolated city for centuries. "You're claiming to be the king of Ravenshadow?" Morgan couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. "I'm not claiming anything," he replied calmly. "I am Griffin Wolfcrest, last of my line, ruler of Ravenshadow. And you, Morgan Silverblood, are the last of a line that was thought to be extinct, the Moon Guardians." Outside, the sounds of pursuit had faded. The creatures had either given up or moved on to search elsewhere. Griffin rose, moving with a slight wince that reminded Morgan of his limp. "The wraith wounded you as well," she observed. He glanced down at his leg, an older injury, one that refuses to heal properly. "Why were you in the forest?" Morgan asked, suddenly realizing how convenient his appearance had been. "I was tracking the shadow wraiths. Their numbers have been increasing as the ritual approaches." He paused. "And I sensed something else, an awakening power that hasn't been felt in Ravenshadow for decades." His gaze fell on the silver locket around Morgan's neck. "Your grandmother's pendant. May I see it?" Reluctantly, Morgan lifted the chain over her head and placed the locket in Griffin's outstretched hand. He examined it carefully, running his thumb over the crescent moon engraving. "This is more than a simple piece of jewelry," he said. "It's a key, a fragment of something much larger and more powerful." "A key to what?" "To your heritage, to the power that lies dormant in your blood." He returned the locket to her. "The Silverbloods were the keepers of moon magic, healers, seers, protectors. They balanced the primal strength of the wolf crests and the shadow mastery of the shadow crests." Morgan slipped the chain back around her neck, feeling the familiar weight of the locket against her skin. "If what you're saying is true, why have I never heard any of this? Why would my family hide it?" "To protect you," Griffin replied. "After the Great Purge, when the Shadow Crests nearly wiped out your entire line, the surviving Silverbloods went into hiding. They buried their powers and their history, becoming ordinary citizens of Ravenshadow." "And my parents? Did they know?" A shadow passed over Griffin's face. "Your father knows some of it. Your mother." He hesitated. "Your mother was one of the last to openly carry the silver blood gift. She died protecting you." Morgan's breath caught in her throat. Her mother had died when she was only 5. "A accident," her father had always said. A fall from the city walls while admiring the view on a foggy evening. It had always seemed a strange, random tragedy. "No," Morgan said, shaking her head. "My mother fell. It was an accident." "It was made to look that way," Griffin said gently. "The Shadowcrests have been hunting the remaining Silverbloods for generations, eliminating any threat to their growing power." The revelation struck Morgan like a physical blow, reopening a wound she thought had long healed. If what Griffin said was true, her entire understanding of her family and herself was built on carefully constructed lies. "The selection ceremony is tomorrow," Griffin continued, changing the subject. "All eligible citizens between 20 and 35 must attend." Morgan grimaced. The selection was an ancient tradition in Ravenshadow, supposedly dating back to the city's founding. Once a year, the nobles and warriors of the city selected partners from among the eligible citizens. Those chosen had little say in the matter. It was considered both an honor and a duty to be selected. "I wasn't planning to attend," Morgan said. "It's an archaic, misogynistic practice." "It's more than that," Griffin replied. "The selection was originally a way to identify potential moon guardians and bond them to protectors. Over time, its true purpose was forgotten, and it became the distorted tradition you know today." "And why are you telling me this?" "Because Lord Dominic Shadowcrest will be presiding over the ceremony this year, and if he recognizes what you are, he will either attempt to capture you for the ritual or kill you on the spot." The gravity of the situation was beginning to sink in. Morgan studied the ancient book in her hands, then looked up at the man claiming to be the king of Ravenshadow. "What do you suggest I do? Hide in a tree for the next 50 years until the next ritual passes?" Griffin's lips quirked in a small smile. "No, I suggest you attend the selection as expected, but be prepared to act when the moment comes." "Act how?" "Sometimes," he said, his gray eyes holding hers, "the best defense is a bold offensive. If Shadowcrest tries to claim you, having already been claimed by another would render his selection void, even by the ancient laws he so rigorously upholds." Morgan arched an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting I find someone to fake a selection with?" "Something like that." Griffin moved toward the entrance of the tree sanctuary, placing his hand on the wood. "It's safe to leave now. The wraiths have moved on." As the wooden door opened, revealing the dark forest beyond, Morgan saw that night had fully fallen. The forest was illuminated by moonlight filtering through the canopy, casting dappled silver patterns across the forest floor. Griffin stepped outside, then turned back to offer his hand. "I'll escort you to the edge of the forest. You should be safe in the city tonight. The wraiths rarely venture beyond the tree line." Morgan accepted his help, noticing that his palm was unusually warm despite the chill night air. As they walked through the moonlit forest, she contemplated everything she had learned. Either this man was completely delusional, or her entire life had been a carefully constructed deception. The journey back was made in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the edge of the forest, the lights of Ravenshadow twinkling through the ever-present mist, Griffin paused. "Your jacket was torn in the fight," he observed. Morgan looked down at her damaged sleeve, crusted with dried blood. "I have others." Griffin removed his outer coat, a well-worn leather garment that appeared to have seen many seasons, and offered it to her. "Take this. It will cover the wound and keep away unwanted questions." Morgan hesitated before accepting the unexpected gift. "Won't you be cold?" A mysterious smile played across his lips. "I rarely feel the cold." She slipped on the coat, which was far too large for her frame, but surprisingly comfortable. It carried a scent of pine and something wilder, like mountain air after a storm. "What happens now?" Morgan asked, looking toward the city that suddenly seemed alien to her. "You return to your life, but with open eyes," Griffin replied. "Watch for signs, trust your instincts, and come to the selection tomorrow." "And if I choose not to?" His expression grew serious. Then Shadowcrest wins by default, and Raven Shadow falls to darkness. Morgan squared her shoulders, a gesture that had become habitual during her military years. Rather dramatic, don't you think? The fate of cities often is. Griffin took a step back toward the forest. Remember what I said about the selection. Sometimes the most effective defense is an unexpected attack. With those words, he turned and disappeared into the trees with remarkable speed, his slight limp seemingly forgotten. Within seconds, he had vanished completely from view, leaving Morgan alone at the forest's edge. She stood for a moment, clutching the ancient book to her chest, Griffin's oversized coat enveloping her like armor. The silver locket felt unusually warm against her skin, as if responding to the revelations of the night. As Morgan made her way back through the misty streets of Ravenshadow, her mind buzzed with questions. Had her entire life been a carefully orchestrated deception? Was she truly descended from some ancient line of mystical guardians? And most pressingly, what would she do at tomorrow's selection ceremony? By the time she reached her father's bookshop, a plan was beginning to form in her mind. If what Griffin had said was true, if Lord Shadowcrest truly meant her harm, then she would need to take control of her own destiny, no more being a pawn in someone else's game. As she unlocked the shop door, Morgan glanced up at the night sky. The moon hung large and luminous above Ravenshadow, a silver crescent that matched the engraving on her locket perfectly. For the first time in her life, Morgan felt its pull like a physical sensation, a silent call that resonated in her very bones. "Moon Guardian," she whispered to herself, testing the word that Griffin had used to describe her lineage. It felt strange on her lips, yet oddly familiar, like a forgotten childhood nickname suddenly remembered. Tomorrow would bring the selection ceremony and whatever dangers it held. But tonight, beneath the watchful eye of the crescent moon, Morgan Silverblood made a silent vow. She would discover the truth about her family, her heritage, and herself. And if Lord Shadowcrest was indeed her enemy, he would soon learn that the last daughter of Silverblood was not prey to be hunted, but a force to be reckoned with. Morning light filtered through the perpetual mist that shrouded Ravenshadow, casting the ancient city in an ethereal glow. Morgan stood at her bedroom window, watching as the townspeople began their daily routines in the cobblestone streets below. The events of the previous night felt like a dream, but the leather coat hanging on her bedpost and the ancient tome on her desk were tangible reminders that it had all been real. She touched the silver locket around her neck, feeling its familiar weight. Had it always been warm against her skin, or was she only noticing it now because of what Griffin had told her? Moon Guardian. The word still felt foreign on her tongue, yet something deep within her resonated with it. A knock at her door pulled Morgan from her thoughts. Her father's voice called from the other side. "Morgan, are you awake? I need to speak with you." She opened the door to find Thomas Silverblood looking more haggard than when he had left for the book auction. His usually neat salt and pepper hair was disheveled, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. "Dad, what's wrong? Did something happen at the auction?" Thomas stepped into the room, his gaze immediately falling on the ancient book. His face paled. "Where did you get that?" he whispered, his voice strained. Morgan crossed her arms. "You know exactly what it is, don't you? Just like you know what this is." She touched her locket. "Why have you been lying to me my entire life?" Thomas sank onto the edge of her bed, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. "How much do you know?" "I know that our family isn't just simple booksellers. I know that Mom didn't die in an accident." Morgan's voice cracked slightly. "I know about the Silverbloods, the Wolf Crests, and the Shadow Crests, and I know about the moon ritual." Her father closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "Who told you?" "Does it matter?" Morgan countered. "What matters is that you kept me in the dark about my own heritage, my own identity." "To protect you," Thomas insisted, leaning forward. "Everything I've done, everything your mother and grandmother did, was to keep you safe." "From the Shadow Crests?" Thomas's eyes widened. How do you— A shadow wraith attacked the shop yesterday. It stole the book, but I managed to get it back. Morgan didn't mention Griffin. Something told her to keep that part to herself for now. Her father stood and began pacing the small room. If the wraiths have found you, then Lord Shadowcrest knows. We need to leave Ravenshadow immediately. Run away? Morgan shook her head. That's not happening. The selection ceremony is today. Thomas froze mid-step. You can't possibly be thinking of attending. It's a trap, Morgan. Shadowcrest will be presiding, and if he recognizes what you are, he'll try to capture or kill me. Yes, I know the risks. Morgan moved to the window again, looking out at the mist-shrouded city she had called home her entire life. But I'm tired of running, of hiding who I am. I didn't even know what I was hiding from until yesterday. She turned to face her father. Tell me the truth, all of it. What happened to Mom? What is this locket really? And what does Shadowcrest want with me? Thomas sighed heavily and gestured for her to sit. When they were both seated, he began in a low voice. The silver bloodline has always been matrilineal. The gift, the ability to channel moon energy for healing, protection, and sight, passes strongest from mother to daughter. Your grandmother Eleanor was one of the most powerful moon guardians in generations. She served as the balance between the wolf crests and the shadow crests for many years. Served how? Morgan asked. The three founding families, Wolfcrest, Silverblood, and Shadowcrest, formed a pact when Ravenshadow was established. The Wolfcrests would rule with strength and justice, the Silverbloods would heal and protect, and the Shadowcrests would guard the secrets and mysteries. But power corrupts, and the Shadowcrests began to desire more than their allotted share. Thomas's eyes grew distant, lost in memories. When your grandmother discovered that the Shadowcrests were experimenting with forbidden magic, attempting to drain life energy from citizens to enhance their own powers, she confronted them. The confrontation led to what history now calls the Great Purge. The Shadowcrests, with Lord Dominic's father leading them, systematically hunted down and eliminated almost every member of the Silver bloodline. But not all of them, Morgan said quietly. Not grandmother. No, Eleanor escaped with your mother, who was just a child then. They went into hiding, buried their identities, and lived as ordinary citizens. Eleanor opened a small apothecary, using only the most basic of her healing abilities to avoid detection. Your mother grew up knowing who she was, but was forbidden from ever using her gifts. And then she met you. Thomas smiled sadly. Yes, I was a young scholar researching local folklore. I had no idea the woman I fell in love with was part of the very legends I was studying. What happened to her? The truth, Dad. His smile faded. When you were 5, your mother began having visions, glimpses of the future, a power that sometimes manifests in moon guardians. She saw darkness consuming Ravenshadow, saw you in grave danger. She went to the city walls that night to perform an ancient ritual of protection, using the moonlight reflected off the mist to create a shield around you. Thomas's voice broke. Shadowcrest's agents found her there. They had been watching, waiting for any sign of Silverblood magic. They attacked, and in her weakened state from the ritual, she couldn't defend herself. They made it look like an accident, but your grandmother knew the truth. Morgan felt tears welling in her eyes but forced them back. And the locket? It's a shard of the lunar crown, an ancient artifact that amplified the Moon Guardian's powers. When the Great Purge began, Eleanor broke the crown into pieces and scattered them to prevent the Shadowcrests from obtaining its power. This shard has been passed down to you. Why now? Why is Shadowcrest moving against us now? The moon ritual occurs only when specific celestial alignments take place, once every 50 years. The ritual can be used to restore balance between the three powers, but in the wrong hands, it can channel all the power to one source. Dominic Shadowcrest intends to use the ritual to claim both the wolf and moon powers for himself, breaking the ancient pact and subjugating Ravenshadow completely. Morgan touched her locket, which seemed to pulse warmly against her fingertips. And he needs a Silverblood for this ritual. Thomas nodded grimly. Blood of the moon, blood of the wolf, freely given or forcibly taken. That's what the old texts say is required. Morgan stood, her decision made. Then I need to attend the selection. If Shadowcrest plans to make his move, that's where it will happen. It's too dangerous, her father protested. Please, Morgan, we can leave Raven Shadow today, find somewhere safe. And then what? Hide for another 50 years while Shadowcrest grows stronger? Wait for him to track us down again? She shook her head firmly. No, this ends now. Thomas looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and fear. You're so like your mother and grandmother, the same determination. He sighed. If you're going to the selection, at least take this. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in velvet cloth. When he unwrapped it, Morgan saw a delicate silver dagger, no longer than her hand, with a moonstone set in its hilt. This was your grandmother's. It's pure silver, blessed under a full moon. It's one of the few weapons that can harm shadow creatures. Morgan took the dagger, feeling a slight tingle as her fingers closed around the hilt. It felt right in her hand, like an extension of herself. Thank you, she said softly. Thomas embraced her tightly. Whatever happens today, know that I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry for keeping the truth from you for so long. Morgan returned the embrace, allowing herself this moment of connection before what promised to be a day of reckoning. As the bells of Raven Shadow's ancient clock tower began to toll noon, Morgan made her way toward the Great Hall. The impressive structure stood at the center of the city, its granite walls and stained glass windows a testament to the craftsmanship of long-dead artisans. The mist that perpetually shrouded the city seemed to part around the building, as if even the elements recognized its importance. Morgan had chosen her attire carefully, a simple but elegant blue dress that allowed freedom of movement, with Griffin's leather coat over it. The coat was too large, but she had rolled the sleeves and cinched it at the waist with a belt. The silver dagger was concealed in a sheath strapped to her thigh, accessible through a slit she had cut in the dress. Her silver blonde hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and the locket hung visibly around her neck. Citizens streamed toward the Great Hall from all directions. The selection was a major event in Raven Shadow's calendar, a spectacle that even those not participating came to watch. Morgan noticed the curious glances her unusual hair color attracted, as always, but today those looks felt more significant. Was her heritage written so plainly on her face that anyone with the knowledge could recognize it? At the entrance to the Great Hall, officials checked names against a registry of eligible citizens. Morgan presented her identification and was directed to an area designated for unmarried women from the merchant class. The interior of the hall had been arranged with the eligible citizens in concentric semicircles facing a raised dais. The nobles and warriors who would do the selecting would enter from a side door when the ceremony began. Morgan took her place, scanning the crowd for any sign of Griffin. Would he actually be here, or had their forest encounter been some elaborate deception? She still wasn't entirely convinced he was who he claimed to be. The ruler of Raven Shadow was rarely seen in public, preferring to govern through a council of advisors. The hall gradually filled to capacity. The nervous energy was palpable as eligible citizens fidgeted and whispered among themselves. Some looked hopeful, others resigned. Morgan noticed several young women deliberately drawing attention to themselves with elaborate hairstyles and provocative clothing, clearly hoping to be selected by someone of high status. The main doors closed with a resonant boom, and a hush fell over the assembly. A procession of richly dressed officials entered from the side door, led by a tall, imposing figure that could only be Lord Dominic Shadowcrest. He moved with the confident grace of a predator, his silver-streaked black hair and sharply tailored suit projecting an aura of refined menace. Morgan studied him carefully. So this was the man responsible for her mother's death, the enemy her family had hidden from for generations. Despite his elegant appearance, there was something unsettling about his eyes. They seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Lord Shadowcrest took his position at the center of the dais and raised his hands for silence, though the hall was already quiet enough to hear a pin drop. "Citizens of Raven Shadow," he began, his voice carrying effortlessly to every corner of the vast space. "Welcome to the 300th selection ceremony. Today, as our ancestors have done before us, We honor the traditions that have kept our city strong and prosperous for a millennium." He continued with a speech about duty, honor, and the importance of maintaining bloodlines. Morgan barely listened, focusing instead on scanning the line of officials and nobles on the dais. Griffin was not among them. "This year's ceremony holds special significance," Shadowcrest was saying, drawing Morgan's attention back to him. "For the first time in 2 decades, our sovereign ruler, King Griffin Wolfcrest, will honor us with his presence and participation." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Morgan felt her heart rate accelerate. So Griffin had been telling the truth about his identity. "The king will have first selection, as is his right by birth and conquest," Shadowcrest continued, a hint of displeasure barely concealed in his tone. The side doors opened again, and a hush fell over the assembly once more. The figure that entered moved with controlled power, his posture regal despite a slight limp that Morgan immediately recognized. King Griffin Wolfcrest was a striking presence in formal attire, a black suit with silver accents that matched his penetrating gray eyes. Around his neck, draped like a scarf or Medal of Honor, was Morgan's blue jacket from the previous night. Their eyes met across the crowded hall, and for a moment it seemed to Morgan that everyone else faded away. There was recognition in his gaze, and something else, a warning perhaps, or a promise. Shadowcrest bowed with exaggerated deference as Griffin took his place on the dais. "Your Majesty, we are honored by your presence. I have prepared a list of suitable candidates for your consideration." He extended an ornate scroll toward the king. Griffin didn't even glance at the offered document. "I have no need for lists, Lord Shadowcrest. Tonight, I follow only instinct." Without waiting for a response, Griffin descended from the dais and began moving through the semicircles of eligible citizens. The crowd parted before him like water, women lowering their eyes respectfully or gazing at him with undisguised hope as he passed. Morgan remained still, her posture straight, but her mind racing. What game was Griffin playing? Had their meeting in the forest been orchestrated specifically to prepare for this moment? Griffin moved methodically through the assembly, occasionally pausing before a candidate as if considering them. Each time, he would nod politely and continue. The tension in the hall grew with each passing minute. Finally, he approached the section where Morgan stood. She could feel the envious glances of the women around her, many of whom were preening and adjusting their appearance in hopes of catching the king's eye. Griffin stopped before a beautiful dark-haired woman a few feet from Morgan. He studied her for a moment, and the woman trembled visibly under his scrutiny. Then, surprisingly, he smiled kindly and moved on. When he stood before Morgan, the world seemed to still. Up close, she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, like moonlight reflecting off a stormy sea. He reached out and touched the blue jacket she wore, his fingers lingering on the fabric. "My coat suits you," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "It's a bit large," Morgan replied, maintaining her composure despite the hundreds of eyes watching them. Griffin's lips quirked in a slight smile. "The locket belonged to your grandmother. I recognized it immediately." "You knew her?" Eleanor Silverblood was a formidable woman and a trusted advisor. Her loss was felt deeply by those who understood her true value. Before Morgan could respond, Lord Shadowcrest's voice cut through their exchange. "Your Majesty, perhaps you would like to continue the selections. Many worthy candidates await your consideration." Griffin didn't turn or acknowledge the interruption. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on Morgan's face, studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Tell me, Miss Silverblood, why do you oppose our selection tradition?" The question, asked loudly enough for those nearby to hear, sent a ripple of whispers through the crowd. Morgan was aware of Shadowcrest watching them with narrowed eyes. She raised her chin slightly. "I believe no person should own another, Your Majesty. Each should have the freedom to choose their own path, their own partner." A shocked murmur ran through the assembly. Such open criticism of a sacred tradition, spoken directly to the king, was unprecedented. Griffin didn't appear angered by her boldness. If anything, his expression reflected respect. "An interesting perspective. And you believe our tradition equates to ownership?" Is that not what selection implies? One chooses, the other is chosen. The power lies entirely with the selector. Shadowcrest stepped forward, his face tight with controlled fury. Your Majesty, this woman's disrespect for our sacred traditions is unconscionable. Perhaps another candidate would be more appreciative of the honor you bestow. Griffin raised a hand, silencing Shadowcrest without looking at him. I find Miss Silverblood's honesty refreshing, Lord Shadowcrest. Too few in Ravenshadow speak their minds so freely. He turned back to Morgan. Your locket. May I examine it more closely? Morgan hesitated only briefly before lifting the chain over her head and placing the silver pendant in Griffin's outstretched hand. As his fingers closed around it, the locket seemed to pulse with an inner light. Shadowcrest's face paled visibly. Your Majesty, perhaps we should proceed with the ceremony. The other nobles are waiting to make their selections. Griffin ignored him, studying the locket. Do you know what this truly is, Miss Silverblood? A fragment of something larger, Morgan answered, remembering her father's words. A piece of the lunar crown. Griffin's eyes flickered with approval. Yes, once it amplified and focused the power of the Moon Guardians. Even as a fragment, it retains some of that ability. He returned the locket to her, and as their fingers brushed, Morgan felt a strange current pass between them, like static electricity, but warmer, more vital. Straightening to his full height, Griffin turned to address the assembly. Citizens of Ravenshadow, I have made my decision. He gestured to Morgan. I select Morgan Silverblood as my companion. The hall erupted in whispers and gasps. Shadowcrest's expression transformed from surprise to calculated pleasure, and Morgan realized with a chill that this was exactly what he had wanted. With her selected by the king, she would be brought to the palace, accessible for whatever dark ritual he was planning. No, Morgan said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. The single word seemed to echo in the suddenly silent hall. Griffin turned to her, one eyebrow raised in what appeared to be genuine surprise. Shadowcrest's satisfaction gave way to confusion. No, the Lord repeated, as if he had never heard the word before. No one refuses a royal selection. It is unprecedented. It is— He searched for the word. Illegal. Morgan's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. I cannot accept the king's selection because I am already bound to another. The silence in the hall deepened, if that were possible. Even Griffin looked momentarily taken aback, though a flicker of understanding crossed his features almost immediately. Shadowcrest stepped forward, his composure regained. This is absurd. All eligible citizens are registered. There is no record of you being bound to anyone. Not all bonds are recorded in your registries, Lord Shadowcrest, Morgan replied. Some are older, deeper, sworn by ancient rites. What nonsense is this? Shadowcrest demanded, looking to Griffin. Your Majesty, this woman clearly attempts to circumvent our sacred traditions with lies. Griffin studied Morgan's face intently. Who? He asked simply. Who claims you as their own? Morgan's mind raced, remembering Griffin's words from the forest. Sometimes the best defense is a bold offensive. This was the moment to act, to take control of her destiny rather than remaining a pawn in someone else's game. With deliberate movements, she stepped forward until she stood directly before Griffin. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, she made her decision. Without warning, Morgan placed her hands on either side of Griffin's face and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was brief but decisive, a clear statement of intent. When she pulled away, the hall had erupted into chaos. Forgive me, Your Majesty, she said loudly enough for those nearby to hear, but I am already claimed by the Guardian. Shadowcrest pushed through the crowd that had gathered around them. What Guardian? This is preposterous! The one who has returned to Ravenshadow, Morgan continued, improvising based on the fragments of knowledge she now possessed. The one who watches from the shadows, who protects our city from forces that would consume it. Griffin's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and Morgan knew he understood what she was doing. She was creating a fiction, a mysterious figure that could not be disproven because it existed only in legend. The Guardian, Shadowcrest repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. A children's tale, nothing more. Is it? Morgan challenged. Then how do you explain the increasing sightings of shadow wraiths in the city? How do you explain the disappearances in the lower quarter? Something dark threatens Ravenshadow, and the Guardian has returned to fight it. Murmurs swept through the hall as citizens exchanged worried glances. Morgan's words had struck a chord. People had noticed the strange occurrences, but had no explanation for them. Enough! Shadowcrest's voice cracked like a whip. Guards, detain this woman for disrupting the ceremony. Griffin stepped between Morgan and the approaching guards. Stay your hand, Shadowcrest. The ancient laws are clear. If she is indeed claimed by another, my selection cannot stand. A convenient fiction, Shadowcrest snarled. Where is this Guardian? Let him come forward and stake his claim openly. The Guardian works in secret, Morgan replied calmly. His identity must remain hidden to protect his mission. Shadowcrest's face contorted with barely contained rage. Your Majesty, surely you don't entertain this obvious deception. Griffin's expression remained impassive. The claim requires investigation. According to our laws, Miss Silverblood will remain under royal protection until the truth is determined. He turned to Morgan. You will accompany me to the palace while this matter is resolved. Morgan understood immediately. Griffin was providing her with a plausible way to leave with him, rather than being detained by Shadowcrest's guards. She inclined her head in acceptance. This is highly irregular, Shadowcrest protested. The selection must continue with clear outcomes. The girl's claim will be investigated thoroughly, Griffin interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. The selection will proceed without Miss Silverblood. Lord Shadowcrest, please continue with the ceremony. Without waiting for a response, Griffin offered his arm to Morgan. She placed her hand on it, feeling the solid strength beneath the formal attire. As they moved toward the exit, the crowd parted silently, hundreds of eyes following their progress. Morgan could feel Shadowcrest's gaze burning into her back as they left the great hall. She had defied him publicly, had disrupted his carefully laid plans. Whatever came next, she had made herself his target in a way that could not be undone. Outside, a royal carriage waited, its black lacquered surface gleaming even in the muted light of Ravenshadow's perpetual mist. Two guards snapped to attention as Griffin approached, opening the carriage door without a word. Once they were inside and the door closed, Morgan released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The interior was plush but understated, with dark leather seats and subtle silver embroidery. That was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, Griffin said as the carriage began to move. Which do you think it was? Morgan asked, studying his face. Both, perhaps. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. The Guardian? An interesting choice. It seemed fitting. A figure of legend that cannot be disproven because few have seen him. It buys us time. Time we desperately need. Griffin's expression turned serious. Shadowcrest will not give up easily. Your public defiance has forced his hand. He must either discredit your claim or accelerate his plans. You mean the ritual? Griffin nodded. The moon ritual requires specific celestial alignments that occur only once every 50 years. The optimal moment is in 3 days during the full moon, but Shadowcrest could attempt it sooner if he feels his plans are threatened. Morgan touched her locket, which seemed warmer than usual against her skin. My father told me about the ritual this morning. He said Shadowcrest needs blood of the moon, blood of the wolf, to complete it. Yes, the blood of a moon guardian and a wolf crest, freely given or forcibly taken. Griffin's gray eyes met hers. That's why he was pleased when I selected you. It would have delivered both required elements directly into his hands. The carriage turned, and Morgan realized they were not heading toward the central palace, but toward the outskirts of the city. Where are we going? Not to the palace. Shadowcrest has too many eyes and ears there. Griffin glanced out the window at the mist-shrouded buildings. We're going to Wolfcrest Fortress, my ancestral home. It's the safest place in Ravenshadow for you now. As they traveled, the buildings of the city gave way to open countryside, and Morgan caught glimpses of the dense forest beyond. The mist seemed to thin slightly away from the city center, allowing brief views of a craggy mountain range in the distance. "What happens now?" she asked, the reality of her situation sinking in. In the space of 24 hours, her entire understanding of herself and her world had been upended. She had gone from an ordinary bookseller to the last of an ancient magical bloodline, from a citizen to a fugitive. "Now," Griffin said, his voice dropping to a more intimate register, "we prepare you for what's coming. You've spent your life unaware of your heritage, your powers dormant. We have 3 days to awaken the Moon Guardian within you, to give you the knowledge and skills you'll need to face Shadowcrest." "And if we fail?" Griffin's expression darkened. "Then Raven Shadow falls to eternal darkness, and all we have fought to protect for a millennium will be lost." The carriage continued its journey through the mist-laden landscape, bearing them toward Wolfcrest Fortress and whatever destiny awaited them there. Morgan Silverblood, the last Moon Guardian, touched her silver locket and steeled herself for the trials ahead. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on, as her mother and grandmother had before her. She had stepped into the light of her heritage, and there was no returning to the shadows of ignorance. Wolfcrest Fortress rose from the misty landscape like something from another era. Built into the side of a mountain, its ancient stone walls and imposing towers seemed to grow organically from the rocky terrain. Unlike the ornate architecture of Raven Shadow's central palace, the fortress embodied rugged strength and practicality, designed to withstand both physical assaults and the harsh mountain weather. As the carriage approached the massive iron gates, Morgan leaned forward to get a better view. "It's not what I expected," she admitted. Griffin followed her gaze. "What did you expect?" "Something more ceremonial, I suppose. This looks like it was built for war." "Because it was." Griffin's expression darkened slightly. "The Wolfcrests have always been warriors first, rulers second. My ancestors understood that peace is merely the interval between conflicts." The gates swung open silently as they approached, and Morgan noticed guards positioned in the towers above. Unlike the ceremonial guards at the palace, these men and women wore practical armor and carried weapons that showed signs of use. The carriage rolled through a stone courtyard and came to a stop before the main entrance. A tall, weathered man with iron-gray hair stood waiting at the steps. Despite his apparent age, Morgan guessed him to be in his 70s, he carried himself with the straight-backed posture of a lifelong soldier. "Commander Ironheart," Griffin acknowledged as they descended from the carriage. "Your Majesty." The old warrior bowed slightly, then turned his piercing blue eyes to Morgan. His gaze widened in recognition. "By the moon and stars," he whispered. "Eleanor's granddaughter." Morgan was taken aback. "You knew my grandmother?" "I had that honor, yes." Commander Ironheart studied her face with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. "You have her eyes, and her spirit, if I'm not mistaken." Griffin placed a hand on Morgan's shoulder. "Commander Ironheart was my father's most trusted advisor, and is now mine. He's one of the few people in Raven Shadow who remembers the time before the Great Purge, when the 3 families maintained balance." The old commander nodded grimly. "Too few of us remain who remember the old ways. Come inside, both of you. It isn't safe to linger in the open, even here." They followed him through massive wooden doors into the fortress proper. The interior was surprisingly warm after the chill mountain air outside. Torches and braziers illuminated stone hallways decorated with tapestries depicting wolves, moons, and ancient battles. "I've prepared the Blue Chamber," Ironheart said, as he led them deeper into the fortress. It seemed appropriate. They ascended a spiral staircase to the fortress's eastern wing. Here, the stone walls gave way to polished wood in places, and the corridors were wider, more ornate. Ironheart stopped before a set of double doors, carved with an intricate pattern of moons and stars. "The Moon Guardian's chamber," he explained, pushing the doors open. "Every Silverblood who served as advisor to the Wolfcrest kings stayed in this room." Morgan stepped into a spacious chamber, decorated in shades of blue and silver. A large 4-poster bed dominated one wall, while another featured floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the mountains. The room was immaculately maintained, as if waiting for an occupant who had only temporarily stepped out. "My grandmother stayed here?" Morgan asked, running her fingers along a silver-inlaid desk. "Eleanor was the last," Ironheart confirmed. "After she fled during the purge, I kept it ready, hoping someday—" His voice trailed off, and he cleared his throat. "Well, here you are." Griffin moved to the windows, gazing out at the mist-shrouded landscape. "Lord Shadowcrest will be looking for us by now. We should assume his wraiths are already searching the forest paths." "The fortress's old protections still hold," Ironheart assured him. "No shadow creature can cross our boundaries without invitation. Nevertheless, we must begin preparations immediately." Griffin turned to face Morgan. "The ritual takes place in 3 days. By then, you must be ready to face Shadowcrest as a true Moon Guardian." The gravity of the situation settled on Morgan's shoulders like a physical weight. 3 days to master powers she hadn't known she possessed, to embrace a heritage she was only beginning to understand. "How?" she asked simply. Griffin exchanged a glance with Ironheart. "The old ways, the training all Moon Guardians once received, compressed into 3 days instead of years." "It won't be easy," Ironheart warned, "or pleasant. The awakening of dormant powers rarely is." Morgan squared her shoulders, a gesture that had become habitual during her military years. "When do we start?" "We've already begun." Griffin's gray eyes held hers. "The moment you defied Shadowcrest at the selection, you took your first step on this path." Ironheart moved to a cabinet near the bed and withdrew a bundle wrapped in blue silk. "These belong to your grandmother. I've kept them safe all these years, hoping they might someday serve their purpose again." He unwrapped the bundle to reveal a set of clothing unlike anything Morgan had seen in Ravenshadow. The garments were practical, fitted trousers, a tunic, and a long coat, but made of a shimmering fabric that seemed to capture and reflect light in unusual ways. All were various shades of blue and silver, with the crescent moon symbol embroidered at the collar and cuffs. "The ceremonial attire of a Moon Guardian," Griffin explained, "woven with silver thread and bathed in moonlight for strength and protection." Morgan touched the fabric, feeling a subtle tingle against her fingertips. "It's beautiful." "And functional," Ironheart added. "The silver weaving offers some protection against shadow magic. You'll need every advantage in the days ahead." "Change into these," Griffin instructed. "Then meet us in the eastern courtyard. Your first lesson begins at sunset." Morgan watched as the 2 men departed, closing the heavy doors behind them. Alone in the chamber, she took a moment to absorb her surroundings. This room had once been her grandmother's, a woman she had known only through old photographs and her father's stories. Now she stood in Eleanor's place, preparing to take up a mantle she hadn't known existed a day ago. She moved to the windows, gazing out at the mountains bathed in the late afternoon light. The mist that perpetually shrouded Ravenshadow seemed thinner here, allowing glimpses of a world beyond, peaks touched with snow, valleys thick with ancient forests. How many times had her grandmother stood at these same windows, looking out at this same view? Had Eleanor felt the weight of responsibility that now pressed down on Morgan? Had she feared failure as Morgan did now? With a deep breath, Morgan turned from the windows and began changing into the Moon Guardian attire. The fabric settled against her skin like a second skin, lightweight yet substantial. When she was fully dressed, she moved to a full-length mirror mounted on one wall. The woman who stared back at her seemed both familiar and foreign. The practical military posture remained, but the silver blonde hair and ceremonial garments transformed her into someone else, someone older, more powerful, connected to a legacy that stretched back through generations. She touched the silver locket at her throat, the fragment of the lunar crown that had been passed down to her. It felt warmer than usual, pulsing gently against her fingertips like a second heartbeat. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she whispered to her reflection. "But I don't have a choice, do I?" The mirror offered no answers, only the image of a woman standing at the crossroads of her destiny. Morgan made her way through the fortress, following directions provided by a servant to the eastern courtyard. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the stone walls and bathing everything in golden light. The courtyard was circular, with a floor of intricately laid stones forming a pattern that Morgan recognized as a representation of the moon's phases. Griffin stood at the center, waiting. He had changed as well, exchanging his formal attire for simpler clothing that allowed for freedom of movement. Commander Ironheart stood at the edge of the space, observing. "The Moon Guardian's Circle," Griffin explained as Morgan approached. "A sacred training ground for generations of Silverbloods." Morgan stepped onto the patterned stones, feeling a subtle vibration through the soles of her boots. "What exactly will I be learning?" "Everything." Griffin's expression was solemn. "How to channel the moon's energy for healing and protection. How to see through illusions and deceptions. How to use silver as a conduit for your power." "That's impossible in 3 days," Morgan protested. "Under normal circumstances, yes. The training typically took years." Griffin moved to stand before her. "But we don't have years. We have days, and you have advantages your ancestors didn't." "Such as?" "The blood runs strong in you. I sensed it the moment we met in the forest. Your military training has already taught you discipline and focus. And," he gestured to the locket around her neck, "you possess a fragment of the lunar crown, which will amplify your natural abilities." Morgan touched the locket instinctively. "My father said it was a piece of a larger artifact, that my grandmother broke it and scattered the pieces during the Great Purge." "She did," Griffin confirmed, "to prevent the Shadow Crests from obtaining its power. The crown, when whole, could channel and amplify the Moon Guardian's abilities tenfold. Even as fragments, each piece retains some of that power." The sun dipped below the horizon, and as if on cue, the moon began to rise, a waxing gibbous, nearly full. Its silver light fell across the courtyard, causing the pattern in the stones to gleam faintly. "We begin with the most fundamental skill," Griffin said, his voice taking on the tone of an instructor, "sensing and drawing upon moon energy." He gestured for Morgan to stand in the center of the circular pattern. "Close your eyes, or feel the moonlight on your skin." Morgan obeyed, feeling slightly foolish. The moonlight felt like ordinary light to her, perhaps a bit cooler than sunlight, but nothing magical. "Breathe deeply," Griffin continued, his voice low and rhythmic. "The moon's light is more than illumination. It is energy, power, life force. Your ancestors could feel it flowing like water, could draw it into themselves and direct it outward again." Morgan tried to concentrate, to sense what he was describing, but felt nothing unusual. "This isn't working," she said after several minutes of fruitless effort. "It's been dormant in you for too long," Griffin acknowledged. "We need to catalyze the process." He withdrew a small silver dagger from his belt, similar to the one Morgan's father had given her, but larger, with more elaborate engravings on the hilt. "Your hand, please." Morgan hesitated only briefly before extending her right hand, palm up. Griffin drew the blade across her palm in a swift, precise movement. The cut was shallow but stung sharply. Blood welled up, gleaming black in the moonlight. "Now," Griffin instructed, "hold your hand up to the moon. Feel the connection between your blood, silver blood, and the light above." Morgan raised her bleeding palm toward the moon, still skeptical. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then gradually, she began to sense something. A warmth spreading from her hand up her arm, a subtle vibration that seemed to resonate with the silver locket at her throat. "I feel it," she whispered, surprised. Like a current." "That's it," Griffin encouraged. "That's the beginning. Now try to direct that energy back into the wound. Visualize the cut closing, the blood returning to your veins." Morgan concentrated, focusing on the strange sensation flowing through her arm. She imagined it pooling in her palm, knitting together the severed skin, restoring what had been damaged. A gasp from Ironheart broke her concentration. She opened her eyes to see both men staring at her hand. The cut had completely healed, leaving only a faint silver line where the blade had passed. "It worked," Morgan said in disbelief, examining her palm. "Faster than I expected," Griffin acknowledged, a note of respect in his voice. "The gift runs very strong in you, just as it did in your grandmother." For the next several hours, they worked on basic techniques, sensing moon energy, drawing it in, directing it outward again. Morgan discovered that the silver in her clothing helped conduct the energy, allowing her to channel it more efficiently. By midnight, she could create a small sphere of silvery light above her palm, maintaining it for several minutes before exhaustion set in. "Enough for tonight," Griffin finally declared. "You need rest. We'll continue at dawn." Morgan nodded gratefully, suddenly aware of how tired she was. The use of these new abilities drained her in a way that was different from physical exertion, a bone-deep weariness that made her limbs feel leaden. As they made their way back into the fortress, Griffin placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did well. Better than I hoped." "It doesn't feel like enough," Morgan admitted. "Not if I'm going to face Shadowcrest in 3 days." "It's only the beginning," Griffin assured her. "Tomorrow we move beyond the basics." They parted at the door to the blue chamber. Inside, Morgan found that someone had lit the fire and turned down the bed. A tray with bread, cheese, and wine waited on a small table. She ate ravenously, suddenly aware of her hunger. The energy work had depleted her more than she realized. After finishing the simple meal, she moved to the windows, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. The mist had thinned further with nightfall, revealing a vast expanse of forest stretching below the fortress. The trees swayed gently in the mountain breeze, their leaves silvered by moonlight. It was beautiful, peaceful, hard to believe that somewhere in that tranquil scene, shadow wraiths might be searching for her. Movement at the forest's edge caught her attention. A large form emerged from the trees, a wolf, its gray coat gleaming in the moonlight. It was followed by another, and another, until a small pack stood at the border between forest and fortress grounds. The lead wolf, larger than the others, with striking silver fur, raised its muzzle toward the fortress, toward Morgan's window specifically. Even at this distance, she could see its eyes reflecting the moonlight, 2 brilliant points in the darkness. Acting on instinct, Morgan placed her hand against the glass. The silver locket at her throat warmed, and she felt a faint echo of the energy she had been working with earlier. It flowed through her fingertips, and for a moment, just a moment, she sensed something from the wolf below. Not words exactly, but impressions. Watchfulness, protection, kinship. The silver wolf held her gaze for several more seconds, then turned and led the pack back into the forest, disappearing among the trees. Morgan stood at the window long after they had gone, her mind turning over the strange connection she had felt. Was this part of her heritage as well? This link to the wild creatures of the forest? Eventually, exhaustion overcame curiosity. She crawled into the large bed, sinking into its softness. Despite the day's revelations and the challenges that lay ahead, sleep claimed her almost immediately. Her dreams were vivid that night. Images of wolves running through moonlit forests, of women with silver blonde hair like her own wielding light against encroaching darkness. And through it all, a voice that sounded like her grandmother's, though Morgan had been too young when Eleanor died to truly remember it. "The moon does not fight the darkness," the voice whispered. "It illuminates it." Morgan woke at dawn to the sound of knocking at her door. Commander Ironheart stood outside, already fully dressed and armed. "The king awaits you in the western courtyard," he informed her. "Breakfast will be served after your morning training." Morgan quickly prepared herself, splashing cold water on her face from a basin and changing into the Moon Guardian attire. The fabric seemed to shimmer more vibrantly in the morning light, the silver threads catching the sun. The western courtyard was smaller than the eastern one and had a different atmosphere. Where the moon circle had been open to the sky, this space was partially enclosed by stone arches covered in ancient vines. At the center stood a rack of weapons, swords, daggers, staffs, all gleaming with the distinctive sheen of silver. Griffin was already there, examining a slender blade. He looked up as Morgan approached. "Silver weapons," he explained, holding up the sword so it caught the light. "The traditional armaments of a moon guardian. Silver conducts moon energy and is anathema to shadow creatures." Morgan moved closer, examining the array of weapons. Many were ceremonial in appearance, with elaborate engravings and inlaid moonstones, but others were practical combat implements, designed for efficiency rather than beauty. "I'm guessing we're moving beyond energy manipulation today," she observed. A moon guardian must be both healer and warrior, Griffin confirmed. Your military training gives you an advantage, but fighting shadow creatures requires specific techniques. He selected a pair of short silver daggers and handed them to Morgan. These will suit your build and fighting style. They can channel energy while providing close-quarter defense. Morgan tested the weight and balance of the daggers. They were lighter than they looked and fit her hands perfectly. "How did you know my fighting style?" she asked, executing a few practice movements. "I watched you against the wraith in the forest," Griffin replied. "You favor speed and precision over power. These will complement those strengths." For the next several hours, Griffin trained Morgan in the specific techniques used against shadow creatures. The silver weapons, he explained, could disrupt the wraith's physical form when infused with moon energy, causing them actual harm rather than just temporary dispersion. Morgan proved a quick study, her military training evident in her disciplined approach and physical conditioning. By mid-morning, she could channel a modest amount of energy through the silver daggers, creating blades that glowed faintly with inner light. "Good," Griffin approved after a particularly successful demonstration. "Now we test it against an actual opponent." Morgan wiped sweat from her brow. "You're going to summon a wraith?" "Not exactly." Griffin's expression turned somber. "I'm going to show you something few outside the Wolfcrest line have seen." He moved to the center of the courtyard, rolling his shoulders as if preparing for physical exertion. "Stay where you are. The first transformation can be unsettling to witness." Morgan watched in confusion, unsure what he meant by transformation. Then Griffin closed his eyes, his face tightening in concentration. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then gradually, a change came over him. It began subtly, his posture shifting, becoming more predatory. Then his features began to alter, the bones of his face elongating, his skin darkening and sprouting gray fur. The transformation accelerated, his body contorting as it reconfigured from human to animal form. There was no sound beyond the soft crack of reshaping bones and the rustle of clothing falling away from a form it could no longer contain. Where Griffin had stood moments before, a massive wolf now crouched. Its coat was silver gray, its eyes the same storm cloud color as Griffin's human form. The wolf was enormous, standing as tall as a small pony, with powerful muscles rippling beneath its thick fur. Morgan stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed. The legends were true. The Wolfcrest line really could transform into wolves. And not just any wolf. This was the silver wolf she had seen from her window the previous night, the pack leader. "Griffin?" she whispered, her voice uncertain. The wolf inclined its head in what was unmistakably a nod. He, padded toward her, movements fluid and graceful despite the massive size. When he reached her, Griffin circled once, then sat back on his haunches, waiting. Morgan extended her hand hesitantly. Griffin pressed his muzzle against her palm, and immediately she felt a connection similar to the one she had experienced the night before, but stronger, clearer. Not words, but images and impressions flowing into her mind. Forests seen through a wolf's eyes, the joy of running with the pack, the scent of prey on the wind. "I can sense your thoughts," she said in wonder. "Is this part of the Moon Guardian abilities?" An impression of affirmation flowed through the connection. More images followed, Moon Guardians of the past, communing with Wolfcrest rulers in their wolf form, sharing information, coordinating defenses against common threats. "The Moon Bond," Morgan realized. "That's what it's called, isn't it?" Another affirmation, along with a sense of approval. Griffin pulled back, breaking the connection. He moved several paces away, then turned to face Morgan, his posture alert, challenging. The message was clear. Time to put her training to practical use. Morgan readied her silver daggers, focusing on channeling energy into them as Griffin had taught her. The blades began to glow with a soft silver light. What followed was the most unusual sparring match of Morgan's life. Griffin in wolf form was faster and stronger than any human opponent, forcing her to rely on quickness, precision, and the new abilities she was only beginning to master. She had to anticipate his movements, sense his intentions through their nascent bond, and counter appropriately, not to harm, but to demonstrate the techniques she had learned. They trained for over an hour, Morgan's skills improving visibly with each exchange. By the end, she was able to anticipate Griffin's attacks with increasing accuracy and respond with controlled bursts of moon energy through her silver weapons. Finally, Griffin backed away, signaling an end to the session. He disappeared behind a stone arch and moments later emerged in human form again, dressed in fresh clothing. "Impressive progress," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. "The moon bond forms quickly with you." Morgan sheathed her daggers, breathing heavily from the exertion. "That was not what I expected for morning training." "Few moon guardians in training ever sparred with the king in wolf form," Griffin acknowledged. "But as I said yesterday, we don't have the luxury of traditional methods." They made their way back into the fortress, where breakfast awaited in a small private dining room. Morgan ate ravenously, her body demanding replenishment after the energy expenditure of both moon magic and physical combat. "There's something I don't understand," she said between bites. "If the wolf crests can transform into wolves, and the Silverbloods can channel moon energy, what exactly is the Shadow Crest's power? What makes them so dangerous?" Griffin's expression darkened. The Shadow Gift was originally the power to move through darkness unseen, to gather information, to keep secrets, valuable abilities for a society's guardians. But over generations, the Shadow Crests discovered they could use their connection to darkness to drain life energy from others, adding it to their own. "That's what the Wraiths are, aren't they?" Morgan realized. "Shadow Crests who've gone too far in draining others." "Yes. When a Shadow Crest drains too much life force too quickly, the darkness begins to consume them from within. They lose their humanity, becoming creatures of pure shadow, bound to their master's will." "And that's what Dominic Shadowcrest wants to do to all of Ravenshadow? Turn everyone into wraiths?" Griffin shook his head. "Not everyone. Wraiths are useful servants, but they're limited. Dominic wants power, absolute power. The moon ritual, performed under the proper celestial alignment, can permanently transfer the gifts of one bloodline to another." "He wants to take the wolf and moon powers for himself," Morgan concluded. "Exactly. And with all three gifts concentrated in the Shadowcrest line, there would be no balance, no check on their power. Ravenshadow would fall into eternal darkness, its citizens little more than cattle to be fed upon at will." The gravity of the situation settled over Morgan anew. This wasn't just about her heritage, or even justice for her mother's death. The entire city, everyone she had ever known, hung in the balance. "There's more to my training, isn't there?" she asked. "Beyond energy manipulation and combat." Griffin nodded, his gray eyes serious. "Much more. This afternoon, we begin work with the locket, awakening its full potential as a fragment of the lunar crown. And tonight, under the waxing moon, you'll attempt your first true ritual." "Will it be enough? 3 days of training against a lifetime of experience?" "It has to be," Griffin replied simply. "You're the last Silverblood, the last hope for balance in Ravenshadow." Morgan touched the silver locket at her throat, feeling its steady warmth against her skin. 3 days to master powers that had been dormant her entire life. 3 days to prepare for a confrontation with the man responsible for her mother's death. 3 days to save an entire city from a fate worse than destruction. "Then we'd better get back to work," she said, rising from the table with renewed determination. Griffin watched her with an unreadable expression. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said finally. She had the same spirit, the same refusal to surrender, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Morgan met his gaze steadily. "Tell me about her, not just as a moon guardian, but as a person. What was she like?" Griffin's expression softened slightly. "Eleanor Silverblood was the strongest person I've ever known. Fierce in battle, gentle in healing. She could make flowers bloom by moonlight and bring down shadow wraiths with a gesture. But more than her power, it was her compassion that set her apart. She believed the gifts of our bloodlines were meant to serve, not to rule. You knew her well. She was my father's closest advisor and my own teacher when I was young." A shadow passed over Griffin's face.
When the Great Purge began, my father tried to intervene, to protect the silver bloodline. He was murdered for his efforts, along with many others who stood against the Shadow Crests. "I'm sorry," Morgan said softly. Griffin acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod. "Eleanor escaped with your mother, went into hiding. By the time I took the throne, years later, the damage was done. The balance was broken. I've spent the decades since trying to limit the Shadow Crest's power, but without a Moon Guardian to complete the triad. And now here I am," Morgan said. "Untrained, unprepared, but apparently the last hope." "Not entirely unprepared," Griffin countered. "You've survived 30 years with dormant abilities that would have made you a beacon to the Shadow Crests. You've thrived in military service, developing skills that complement your heritage, and you've demonstrated courage and quick thinking in the face of danger." He rose from the table, his expression resolute. "We have work to do, Moon Guardian. The afternoon session begins in the library. It's time you learned the full history of your lineage and the true power of the artifact you carry." As they left the dining room, Morgan felt a curious mixture of dread and anticipation. Her old life as a bookseller's daughter seemed impossibly distant now, replaced by this new reality of ancient powers and deadly rivalries. Yet somehow, beneath the strangeness, there was a sense of rightness, as if she had finally found the path she was meant to walk all along. Whatever came next, whatever challenges awaited in the confrontation with Shadowcrest, she would face them not just as Morgan Silverblood, but as the last Moon Guardian, heir to a legacy of power and protection that stretched back through generations. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but for the first time, she felt equal to bearing it. The moon was rising again, nearly full now, calling to the power in her blood. And this time, she would answer. The fortress library was unlike any Morgan had ever seen. 3 stories of towering bookshelves lined the circular chamber, accessible by ornate spiral staircases and rolling ladders. Ancient tomes bound in leather and metal stood alongside newer volumes and scrolls stored in protective cases. The air carried the familiar scent of old parchment and ink that reminded Morgan of her father's bookshop, though there was something else here, a subtle fragrance of herbs and magic. Tall windows allowed natural light to flood the space, supplemented by ornate silver lanterns that cast a gentle glow reminiscent of moonlight. At the center of the room stood a massive table of polished wood, its surface inlaid with the same lunar cycle pattern Morgan had seen in the eastern courtyard. Commander Ironheart was already present when Morgan and Griffin arrived. He stood before a glass display case containing what appeared to be fragments of silver metal, similar in design to Morgan's locket. "More pieces of the lunar crown," Griffin explained, following Morgan's gaze. "We've recovered 3 fragments over the decades. With yours, that makes 4. "How many pieces are there in total?" Morgan asked. 7, Ironheart replied. "Your grandmother broke the crown into 7 fragments during the Great Purge, each representing a phase of the moon. She kept the crescent for herself, the piece you now wear, and scattered the others." Morgan touched her locket instinctively. "And Shadowcrest has been hunting for them ever since." "Yes, we believe he possesses 2 fragments. With your locket, that leaves 1 piece still unaccounted for." Griffin moved to the center table, where several ancient texts lay open. Each fragment has unique properties, tied to the moon phase it represents. The crescent, your piece, is associated with revealing hidden truths and illuminating deception. It's particularly effective against shadow illusions. "Which is why the wraith in the forest reacted so strongly when it recognized my locket," Morgan realized. "Exactly," Griffin gestured toward the ancient books. "Today, we focus on awakening the full potential of your fragment. The locket has been dormant for years, protecting you by masking your true nature. Now we need it at full strength." Morgan removed the locket from around her neck and placed it on the table. In the library's ethereal light, the silver seemed to glow with an inner radiance, the crescent moon engraving more pronounced than she remembered. "How do we awaken it?" Griffin opened one of the ancient tomes, revealing illustrations of the complete lunar crown alongside detailed text in an archaic script. The crown fragments respond to 2 things, moonlight and silver blood. You've already established a basic connection through your training yesterday.
Now we deepen that bond." Ironheart approached with a small silver bowl and a ceremonial knife. "A drop of your blood, freely given, will reforge your family's connection to the artifact." Morgan nodded her understanding. She had already crossed this threshold during yesterday's training. Taking the knife, she made a small cut on her fingertip and allowed a single drop of blood to fall into the silver bowl. Griffin added clear water from a crystal decanter, then crushed dried herbs that released a sharp, clean scent reminiscent of mountain air. He stirred the mixture with a silver rod, murmuring words in an ancient language that seemed to resonate in the air. "Now place your locket in the bowl," he instructed. Morgan did as directed. The moment the silver touched the mixture, the liquid began to glow with a soft blue-white light. The locket seemed to absorb the illumination, growing brighter by the second. "Take it," Griffin urged. "Complete the connection." Morgan reached into the glowing liquid and grasped the locket. A sensation like lightning coursed up her arm, not painful, but intensely alive, as if every nerve ending had suddenly awakened. The library around her seemed to fade, replaced by a cascade of images. Women with silver blonde hair like her own, wielding power that flowed from moon to flesh to silver and back again. Battles against shadow creatures, healing rituals under full moons, and her grandmother, younger than Morgan had ever known her, placing this very locket around the neck of an infant. As abruptly as it had begun, the vision ended. Morgan found herself still standing in the library, the locket clutched in her palm. But something had changed. The connection she had felt to the artifact before was now magnified tenfold. It was no longer simply a piece of jewelry, but an extension of herself, a conduit for power that had always existed in her blood. "What did you see?" Griffin asked softly. Morgan described the visions, watching as Griffin and Ironheart exchanged meaningful glances. "The locket has accepted you," Ironheart said. "It recognizes you as the true heir of the silver bloodline." "More than that," Griffin added. "It's showing you your heritage, the knowledge and memories of past moon guardians, preserved within the silver." Morgan slipped the chain back around her neck. The locket settled against her skin with a sense of rightness, its weight familiar, yet somehow different, more significant. "I can feel it," she said, "like a reservoir of power that wasn't accessible before." Griffin nodded. "The fragment is fully awakened now. With practice, you'll learn to draw upon its specific abilities. But first, there's something else you need to see." He led Morgan to another table, where a large map of Ravenshadow and its surroundings was spread out. Unlike ordinary maps, this one seemed to shimmer slightly, with lines of silver and blue tracing patterns across the landscape. "The ley lines of Ravenshadow," Griffin explained, "channels of natural energy that flow through the earth. The 3 founding families built the city at their intersection for a reason. These energies enhance our respective gifts." Morgan studied the map with newfound fascination. She could see how the lines converged at key points: the fortress, the central palace, the ancient temple at the city's heart, and an unmarked location deep in the forest. "What's here?" she asked, pointing to the forest location. "The lunar glade," Ironheart answered, "a natural amphitheater where the ley lines are closest to the surface. It's the traditional site for the moon ritual." "And where Shadowcrest will attempt his version in 2 days' time," Griffin added grimly, "during the full moon, when the convergence of celestial and terrestrial energies reaches its peak." Morgan traced the path from the fortress to the glade with her finger. "You said I would attempt my first true ritual tonight. What exactly does that entail?" Griffin exchanged a look with Ironheart before answering. "Connecting with the wolf pack. As a moon guardian, you share a natural bond with wolves, especially those aligned with the wolf crest line. That connection will be vital in the coming confrontation." "The silver wolf I saw last night, that was you." "Yes, I was leading the pack on their nightly patrol of our territory. They sensed your presence in the fortress, the first moon guardian to dwell here in decades. They were curious." "And tonight?" "Tonight, you'll meet them properly. Establish the bond that will make them allies in battle rather than simply observers." For the remainder of the afternoon, Morgan studied the ancient texts under Griffin and Ironheart's guidance. She learned more about the history of the three founding families, the nature of the gifts they carried, and the intricate balance that had maintained peace in Raven Shadow for centuries before the Great Purge. The texts confirmed what Griffin had told her. The Shadowcrests had gradually corrupted their gift, turning from guardians of secrets to manipulators of darkness. The Wraiths were the physical manifestation of that corruption, humans who had been consumed by shadow magic until nothing of their original selves remained. As the sun began to set, Morgan felt a growing anticipation. The awakened locket pulsed gently against her skin, more responsive to the approaching moonrise. Her own awareness seemed heightened as well. She could sense the energies Griffin had shown her on the map, flowing beneath the fortress like underground rivers. "It's time," Griffin announced, closing the ancient tome he had been studying. "Change into the ceremonial attire. We leave for the forest in half an hour." In her chamber, Morgan found fresh Moon Guardian garments laid out on the bed, similar to what she had worn during the day, but with additional silver embellishments that would reflect moonlight. She changed quickly, securing her silver daggers at her waist and ensuring the locket was prominently displayed. A soft knock at her door announced Griffin's arrival. He, too, had changed, though his attire was simpler, dark clothing designed for ease of movement and quick transformation. "Ready?" he asked. Morgan nodded, feeling a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. "As I'll ever be." They made their way through the fortress and out a small side gate that led directly into the forest. The sun had fully set, and the waxing moon cast silver light through the branches, creating a dappled path before them. Griffin moved with confident familiarity, leading Morgan deeper into the woods along trails invisible to the casual observer. After nearly an hour of walking, they emerged into a small clearing. Unlike the dense forest surrounding it, this space was open to the sky, with a perfect view of the moon overhead. Stones had been arranged in a circle, each carved with symbols similar to those Morgan had seen in the ancient texts. "The meeting place," Griffin explained. "Neutral ground where humans and wolves have communed for generations." He moved to the center of the stone circle and motioned for Morgan to join him. "The ritual is simple in concept, but requires complete openness. You must allow your consciousness to expand beyond your physical form, to touch the awareness of the pack." "And how exactly do I do that?" "The locket will guide you. It carries the memories of those who came before, who performed this ritual countless times. Trust those memories. Trust your blood." Griffin stepped back, giving Morgan space. "I'll remain in human form to anchor you, but I'll be watching through the pack bond as well. If you begin to lose yourself, I'll pull you back." Morgan took a deep breath and closed her eyes, centering herself as Griffin had taught her. She touched the awakened locket, feeling its steady warmth against her fingertips. "Trust your blood," he had said. "Trust the memories." She opened herself to the locket's influence, allowing the ancient knowledge it contained to flow into her consciousness. Images and sensations cascaded through her mind, instructions without words, understanding without explanation. Following this intuitive guidance, Morgan raised her face to the moon and began to channel its energy. Unlike her previous attempts, which had been focused and controlled, this time she allowed the power to flow through her unfiltered, filling her until her skin seemed to glow with silver light. A howl broke the silence of the night, long, haunting, and unmistakably a summons. It was answered by another, then another, until the forest echoed with the voices of the wolf pack, drawing closer. Morgan remained still, continuing to channel the moon's energy as the first wolves appeared at the edge of the clearing. They emerged from the shadows one by one, padding silently into the stone circle. The silver wolf she had seen the previous night, not Griffin, but another alpha, led them, its blue eyes fixed intently on Morgan. The pack formed a ring around her, 12 wolves of varying sizes and colors, all watching with an intelligence that transcended animal awareness. The silver alpha approached cautiously, stopping a few feet away. Following the guidance flowing from the locket, Morgan knelt slowly, bringing herself closer to the wolf's eye level. She extended her hand, palm up, in a gesture that was simultaneously an offering and an invitation. The silver wolf studied her for a long moment, its gaze seemingly penetrating beyond flesh to the essence beneath. Then, with deliberate movements, it stepped forward and pressed its muzzle against her palm. The contact was electric. Morgan's consciousness expanded suddenly, flowing outward to touch not just the mind of the alpha but the entire pack. Their awareness became hers, the sharp clarity of their senses, the bond that unified them, the ancient knowledge passed through generations. Images flashed through this shared consciousness, the pack hunting beneath the moon, defending their territory against shadow wraiths, running alongside humans who glowed with silver light, like Morgan herself. The memories stretched back through decades, perhaps centuries, a lineage as old as Raven Shadow itself. In return, Morgan opened her own memories to them, her life in the city, her military service, the recent awakening to her heritage. She showed them Shadowcrest, the threat he posed, the darkness that would consume everything if he succeeded. Understanding flowed between human and wolf, wordless but profound. The pack recognized Morgan as something both familiar and new, a moon guardian, yes, but one with her own unique strength and perspective. And Morgan, in turn, recognized the wolves as more than animals, more than allies. They were kin of a sort, bound by ancient pacts and shared purpose. The Silver Alpha pulled back, breaking the direct connection, but leaving the awareness of the pack bond intact. It turned to look at Griffin, who had remained at the edge of the stone circle, then back to Morgan. A clear message passed between them: acceptance. One by one, each wolf in the pack approached Morgan, briefly touching their muzzle to her hand, acknowledging the bond. When the last had done so, the alpha threw back its head and howled, a sound of celebration rather than summons. The others joined, creating a harmony that resonated through the forest and seemed to make the very moonlight vibrate. Morgan rose to her feet, feeling simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. The connection with the pack remained, a subtle awareness at the edge of her consciousness that she sensed would now always be present. Griffin approached, his expression one of quiet amazement. "I've never seen them accept someone so completely, so quickly." "It felt right," Morgan said, struggling to articulate the experience. "Like remembering something I'd forgotten, rather than learning something new." "That's the blood memory," Griffin explained. "The knowledge carried in your lineage, awakened by the locket." The Silver Alpha circled them once, then led the pack to the edge of the clearing. Before disappearing into the forest, it paused, looking back at Morgan with those intelligent blue eyes. A final message flowed through their connection: "We will come when called." Then the wolves were gone, melting into the shadows as silently as they had appeared. "They'll patrol the borders tonight," Griffin said. "If Shadowcrest's wraiths approach, we'll know." Morgan nodded, her newfound connection confirming his words. She could sense the pack spreading out through the forest, alert and watchful. It was a strange feeling, this awareness extending beyond her physical form, but not an unpleasant one. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we return to the fortress. Tomorrow we begin the final phase of your preparation, combining the skills you've learned into a cohesive whole." They walked back through the moonlit forest in companionable silence. Morgan was grateful for the quiet, needing time to process the bond she had just formed. The wolves' consciousness still echoed in her mind, their perceptions occasionally bleeding into her own, the scent of prey on the wind, the feel of earth beneath paws, the unity of the pack. When they reached the fortress, Griffin paused at the entrance to the eastern wing, where Morgan's chamber was located. "You've progressed faster than I dared hope," he said. "The gift runs very strong in you." "It's still not enough," Morgan replied, her earlier elation giving way to practicality. "Shadowcrest has had decades to master his abilities. I've had days." "True," Griffin acknowledged, "but you have advantages he doesn't. The pack bond, for one, the awakened locket, for another. And perhaps most importantly, you fight to protect, not to possess. That matters." He hesitated, then added more softly, "Your grandmother once told me that true power comes not from what we can take, but from what we're willing to give. Remember that." With those words, he bid her good night, leaving Morgan to ponder their meaning as she prepared for sleep. The day's revelations and experiences swirled in her mind, slowly coalescing into a deeper understanding of the path that lay before her. As she drifted toward sleep, the pack awareness remained, a comforting presence at the edge of her consciousness. Through their eyes, she glimpsed the forest at night, a world of scent and sound and subtle movement, beautiful in its wildness. It was the last thing she remembered before dreams claimed her. Morgan woke before dawn, roused by a sense of urgency flowing through the pack bond. She sat up, instinctively reaching for the locket around her neck. Through the wolves' awareness, she sensed intruders in the forest, shadow wraiths, at least 5 of them, probing the boundaries of Wolfcrest territory. She dressed quickly in her Moon Guardian attire and made her way through the silent fortress. Griffin met her in the main hall, his expression confirming that he too had sensed the threat. "Shadowcrest scouts," he said without preamble, "testing our defenses." "The pack is tracking them," Morgan replied, drawing on the shared awareness. "They haven't engaged yet." Griffin nodded. "They won't unless directly threatened. Fighting wraiths requires specific abilities." He studied her face. "How clear is the pack bond for you?" "Very. I can see through their eyes if I concentrate, sense their locations, and what they're tracking." "Good. We can use that." Griffin led her to a small chamber off the main hall, where a detailed 3-dimensional model of the fortress and surrounding territory had been constructed. "Show me where the wraiths are." Morgan closed her eyes briefly, focusing on the pack awareness. When she opened them, she pointed to several locations on the model with unerring accuracy. "Here, here, and here, 2 more moving along this ridge." Commander Ironheart entered the chamber, fully armed despite the early hour. "The perimeter guards report shadow activity at the eastern boundary," he announced, then noticed Morgan. "You sense them too." "Through the wolf pack," she confirmed. "They're being cautious, staying just beyond the fortress's protective boundaries." Griffin studied the positions Morgan had indicated on the model. "They're testing the extent of our awareness, looking for blind spots in our defenses." He turned to Ironheart. "Double the guard at the southern approach. It appears unobserved, but that's where they'll strike if they attempt anything." The old commander nodded and departed to relay the orders. Griffin turned back to Morgan. "This changes our training schedule for today. Shadowcrest is moving faster than anticipated. We need to accelerate your preparation." "What did you have in mind?" "Combat against actual wraiths, not just theory or practice with me in wolf form." Griffin's expression was grave. "It's dangerous, but necessary. You need to experience their true nature before facing them in the lunar glade." Morgan felt a flutter of apprehension, but nodded her agreement. "How do we draw them in without endangering the fortress?" "We don't. We go to them." Griffin moved to a cabinet and withdrew 2 silver-chased cloaks. "These will help mask our approach. We'll move beyond the fortress's boundaries into territory where the wraiths are scouting." Morgan accepted one of the cloaks, feeling the subtle energy woven into its fabric. "Just the 2 of us?" 3. Griffin glanced toward the doorway where Ironheart had reappeared. "The commander knows shadow wraiths better than anyone. He fought them during the Great Purge." Ironheart nodded grimly. "And I bear the scars to prove it." They prepared quickly, gathering silver weapons and small vials of what Griffin called moon essence, distilled energy that could be used to temporarily blind or disorient wraiths. Morgan strapped her twin daggers at her waist and concealed several smaller throwing blades within her clothing. As they made ready to depart, Griffin pulled Morgan aside. "Stay close to me or Ironheart at all times. Wraiths are dangerous individually, but deadly in groups. They coordinate through a hive mind of sorts, sharing information instantly." "Like the wolf-pack bond?" "Similar, but corrupted. The wolves maintain their individual awareness within the greater whole. Wraiths lose themselves entirely to the collective consciousness controlled by their master." The sun was just cresting the horizon as they slipped out through a hidden postern gate, avoiding the main approaches to the fortress. Griffin led them along a narrow path that descended the mountainside through dense forest. Through the pack bond, Morgan sensed the wolves tracking their progress, maintaining a protective perimeter but remaining out of sight. The silver alpha, whom Griffin had named Silverfang, kept closest watch, its awareness most strongly connected to Morgan's. They moved in silence for nearly an hour, descending into a valley where the mist lay thick between the trees. Here, the forest felt older, wilder. The ley lines Griffin had shown her on the map pulsed beneath their feet, channels of energy that made Morgan's awakened senses tingle. "We're beyond the fortress's protective boundary now," Ironheart murmured, his hand resting on the hilt of his silver sword. "The wraiths will sense our presence soon, if they haven't already." Griffin nodded, scanning the mist-shrouded forest with alert eyes. "Morgan, can you feel them through the locket? One of its powers is detection of shadow energy." Morgan touched the silver pendant, focusing her awareness as she had been trained. Immediately, she sensed disturbances in the natural energy flow of the forest, cold spots where something was drawing life force from the surroundings. "There," she whispered, pointing to their left, where the mist seemed unnaturally thick. "And there." She indicated another location to their right. "They're circling us." "Good," Griffin approved. "Now reach for the moon energy as we practiced. Channel it through your weapons." Morgan drew her silver daggers, focusing her will through the awakened locket. Energy flowed from her center, down her arms, and into the blades, causing them to glow with a soft silver light. The sensation was becoming familiar now, almost natural. A wraith materialized from the mist to their left, a humanoid form composed of swirling darkness, with eyes like empty voids. Unlike the creature she had encountered in the forest, this one made no attempt to maintain a human appearance. It was shadow given form, hunger made manifest. "Hold steady," Griffin instructed, drawing his own weapon, a long silver sword that blazed with concentrated moonlight. "Let it approach." The wraith drifted closer, its movements unnaturally fluid. Morgan could feel its attention fixed on her, drawn by the energy she channeled. Through the pack bond, she sensed the wolves tensing, ready to intervene if needed, though they remained hidden among the trees. "Now!" Griffin commanded, as the wraith came within striking distance. Morgan moved with the speed and precision of her military training, enhanced by the moon energy flowing through her. Her first dagger slashed through the wraith's form, drawing a keening wail as silver light disrupted its shadowy substance. The second strike came from below, driving upward through what would have been the creature's chest in a human. The wraith convulsed, its form temporarily destabilized by the infusion of opposing energy. Before it could recover, Griffin's blade swept through its neck region, severing the connection between form and consciousness. The wraith dissolved into wisps of shadow that quickly dissipated in the morning light. "Well done," Griffin said, but there was no time for further praise. 3 more wraiths emerged from the mist, advancing with predatory intent. What followed was the most intense combat of Morgan's life. The wraiths attacked with coordinated precision, one distracting while others struck from flanks or behind. Only the wolf pack's warning awareness and Ironheart's experienced guidance prevented them from being overwhelmed. Morgan's training proved its worth. Her silver daggers flashed with moon energy as she dispatched wraith after wraith, each victory building her confidence and control. She discovered that the locket enhanced her ability to predict their movements, sensing disturbances in the energy field moments before attacks materialized. Griffin fought with the fluid grace of someone born to battle, his sword an extension of himself. Occasionally, he would shift partially, not a full transformation, but enough to enhance his strength and speed, his eyes glowing wolf gray in his human face. Ironheart, despite his age, moved with deadly efficiency, his experience evident in every calculated strike. He favored defensive tactics, creating opportunities for Morgan and Griffin to deliver finishing blows. Just as they dispatched the last visible wraith, Morgan sensed a larger disturbance approaching, a cold void in the forest's energy that made her locket pulse with warning. "Something's coming," she alerted the others. "Something stronger." A figure emerged from the mist, humanoid in form, but composed of deeper, more concentrated shadow than the wraiths they had faced. It moved with deliberate purpose rather than predatory instinct, and its eyes glowed with malevolent intelligence. "A Shadow Lord," Ironheart identified grimly. "Shadowcrest's lieutenant." The Shadow Lord raised its hands, and the mist around them thickened, darkened, becoming almost solid. The temperature dropped precipitously, and Morgan's breath emerged in white plumes. Through the pack bond, she sensed the wolves' growing agitation. They could feel the unnatural cold spreading through their territory. "It's drawing energy from the ley line," Griffin warned, "preparing to attack." Morgan focused on her locket, remembering what Griffin had told her about its specific power, revealing hidden truths, illuminating deception. The Shadow Lord was manipulating the mist, using it as both weapon and shield. If she could counter that. Acting on instinct guided by the locket's ancient knowledge, Morgan channeled moon energy in a new pattern, focusing not on her weapons, but on the silver pendant itself. It responded instantly, blazing with light that cut through the manipulated mist like a beacon through fog. The Shadow Lord recoiled, its concentration broken. The solidifying mist dissolved back into ordinary vapor, and the temperature began to rise again. In that moment of vulnerability, Griffin struck, his silver sword slashing through the creature's defenses. Ironheart followed with a thrust to what would have been its heart, and Morgan completed the attack with a dual strike that severed its connection to the ley line's energy. The Shadow Lord collapsed in on itself, dissipating with a sound like a distant scream. As it vanished, Morgan felt a psychic backlash, a surge of awareness that wasn't her own, a mind touching hers briefly before being severed. "Shadowcrest," she gasped, recognizing the cold, calculating presence she had glimpsed. He was watching through it. Griffin nodded grimly. "Shadow Lords are extensions of their master's will. He knows we're preparing. He knows about you." "Good," Morgan said with unexpected ferocity. "Let him know what's coming for him." They returned to the fortress without further incident, though Morgan maintained vigilance through the pack bond. The wolves continued their patrol, alert for any remaining wraiths, but the forest had grown quiet again, as if holding its breath in the wake of the confrontation. Back within the fortress walls, they regrouped in the library to assess what they had learned. Morgan described the psychic connection she had sensed when the Shadow Lord was destroyed. "Shadowcrest was using it to scout our defenses, our capabilities," she explained. "He wanted to see what I could do." "And what we were willing to reveal," Griffin added. "It was a test on both sides." Commander Ironheart spread the map of Ravenshadow on the table. The Shadow Lord was positioned here, directly over a minor ley line. It was drawing power to send back to Shadowcrest. "Gathering energy for the ritual," Griffin concluded. "Every bit he can collect strengthens his position." Morgan studied the map, her attention drawn to the lunar glade where the ritual would take place. "Tomorrow night, the full moon." "Yes, Shadowcrest will have prepared the site already. He'll bring the fragments of the lunar crown he possesses, and with them attempt to draw the power of both wolf and moon into himself." "Which requires my blood and yours," Morgan said, "freely given or forcibly taken." Griffin nodded solemnly. "That's why we must strike first, before he can complete the ritual preparations. We'll leave at dawn tomorrow, approach through the forest with the wolf pack as our guides. And once we reach the glade, you'll perform a counter-ritual, one your grandmother designed but never had the opportunity to implement. It requires the fragments we possess and your awakened abilities as a moon guardian." Ironheart retrieved an ancient scroll from a locked cabinet. "Eleanor left this in my safekeeping before she fled. It contains the specific incantations and patterns for the counter-ritual." Morgan accepted the scroll carefully, feeling a connection to her grandmother as she touched the parchment. "What will it do exactly?" "Restore balance," Griffin explained. "The counter-ritual will realign the three founding powers to their original purpose, cleansing the corruption that has tainted the Shadowcrest line." "Will it harm them?" "Only those who have given themselves fully to the shadow. For the others, it offers redemption, a return to their original purpose as keepers of secrets rather than harvesters of life force." Morgan unrolled the scroll, studying the intricate diagrams and ancient text. Much of it was in the same archaic language as the library books, But to her surprise, she found she could understand portions of it, another benefit of the awakened locket and the memories it contained. "I'll need time to study this," she said, "to understand the patterns and incantations." "You have until dawn," Griffin replied. "We've spent the day on combat training. The rest of today and tonight must be devoted to ritual preparation." Morgan nodded, already immersing herself in her grandmother's work. The patterns were complex but beautiful, representing the interconnected nature of the three founding powers. At the center of the main diagram was a symbol combining wolf, moon, and shadow in perfect balance. As she worked through the scroll, Morgan found herself developing a deeper appreciation for her grandmother. Eleanor had been not just a powerful moon guardian, but a visionary who had seen beyond the immediate threat to the underlying imbalance that had allowed the Shadow Crest to corrupt their gift in the first place. The counter ritual wasn't designed merely to defeat Shadow Crest, but to heal the wound in Raven Shadow's spiritual foundation, to restore what had been broken during centuries of gradual drift from the founding principles. Hours passed as Morgan studied, practiced the incantations, and committed the patterns to memory. Griffin and Ironheart provided guidance when needed, but largely left her to work independently, recognizing that this was as much a personal journey as a practical preparation. As evening approached, Griffin announced that they would conduct a final practice ritual in the eastern courtyard, under the nearly full moon. This would be Morgan's opportunity to combine all she had learned: energy manipulation, combat skills, wolf bond, and ritual knowledge into a cohesive whole. The moon rose large and luminous over the fortress as they gathered in the Moon Guardian's circle. Morgan had changed into the most formal of the ceremonial attires provided to her, a silver-blue ensemble with intricate embroidery depicting the phases of the moon. The awakened locket gleamed at her throat, pulsing in harmony with the moonlight overhead. Griffin had brought the 3 lunar crown fragments recovered over the years, placing them at strategic points around the circle. Morgan added her locket to complete the pattern, feeling the energy begin to flow between the pieces even before the ritual began. "Remember," Griffin instructed as they prepared, "the ritual is not just words and patterns, it's intent. Your will channeled through the ancient forms. The Moon Guardian's power comes from both moon and heart, silver and blood." Morgan nodded, centering herself in the middle of the circle. Through the pack bond, she could sense the wolves gathering in the forest below, adding their awareness to the working. Silverfang led them in a low, harmonizing howl that seemed to resonate with the energy building in the courtyard. Following the instructions in her grandmother's scroll, Morgan began the ritual. She drew moon energy through the locket, channeling it into the pattern laid out on the courtyard stones. The silver fragments responded, each beginning to glow with its own inner light, creating a complex web of energy that mirrored the ley lines beneath Raven Shadow. As the ritual progressed, Morgan felt her consciousness expanding, similar to what she had experienced with the wolf bond, but broader, deeper. She sensed the fortress, the forest, the city beyond, all connected by the flowing energy she now manipulated. Within this expanded awareness, she could feel the darkness gathering at the lunar glade. The shadow energy Shadow Crest was accumulating for his own ritual. The counter-pattern she created pushed against that darkness, not destroying it, but balancing it, containing it within proper bounds. This was the essence of her grandmother's design, not elimination, but restoration, harmony rather than dominance. When the ritual reached its culmination, the 4 fragments of the lunar crown rose from their positions, suspended in the air by the energy Morgan channeled. They began to orbit around her, moving faster and faster until they appeared as a single ring of silver light. For a brief, transcendent moment, Morgan glimpsed what the complete crown must have been. A perfect circle of moonlight made solid, a physical manifestation of the bond between Silverblood and lunar power. The vision filled her with both awe and determination. This was her heritage, her responsibility, her gift to protect. The fragments gradually slowed their orbit and descended gently back to their positions. Morgan completed the final incantation, and the energy field collapsed inward, absorbed back into the locket and the other fragments, which now glowed with a steady, confident light. Griffin approached, his expression one of profound respect. "You've mastered in days what takes most moon guardians years to achieve." "Not mastered," Morgan corrected, retrieving her locket. "But I understand now. I can feel the pattern, the balance." "Will it be enough?" Ironheart asked, the practical soldier never far beneath his reverent exterior. "It will have to be," Griffin replied. "Dawn comes in a few hours. We should rest while we can." As they gathered the fragments and prepared to retire, Morgan felt a sudden chill, a cold awareness brushing against her consciousness. Through the pack bond, she sensed the wolves tensing, alerting to an intruder. "He's watching," she said quietly. "Shadowcrest. I can feel him testing the boundaries." Griffin nodded grimly. "He knows we're coming. He's preparing." "Let him prepare," Morgan replied, touching the awakened locket at her throat. "Tomorrow, we restore balance to Ravenshadow one way or another." The certainty in her voice surprised even herself. 3 days ago, she had been Morgan Silverblood, bookseller's daughter and former soldier. Now she stood as the last moon guardian, heir to an ancient legacy, preparing to confront the darkness that had claimed her mother's life and threatened her city. As she returned to her chamber for a few hours of rest, Morgan felt not fear, but readiness. Whatever came with the dawn, she would face it with the strength of her bloodline, the wisdom of her grandmother's design, and the bond of wolf and moon and silver that now flowed through her very being. The battle for Ravenshadow's soul would begin with the rising sun. Dawn broke over Wolfcrest Fortress with deceptive serenity. The mist that perpetually shrouded Ravenshadow had thinned overnight, allowing the first rays of sunlight to paint the ancient stones in hues of gold and amber. Morgan stood at her chamber window, watching as the mountain landscape emerged from shadow into light. The beauty of the scene belied the gravity of what lay ahead. She had slept little, spending most of the night reviewing her grandmother's ritual and meditating on the connection between the locket and the 3 lunar crown fragments they possessed. Through the pack bond, she had sensed the wolves patrolling tirelessly, alert for any shadow presence that might threaten the fortress. A soft knock at her door announced Griffin's arrival. He entered looking as though he too had found little rest. His face was composed but grave, the burden of leadership evident in the set of his shoulders. "It's time," he said simply. Morgan nodded. She was already dressed in the ceremonial Moon Guardian attire, silver daggers secured at her waist, and smaller blades concealed throughout her clothing. The awakened locket gleamed at her throat, pulsing gently with an inner light that seemed brighter, more confident than before. "The fragments?" she asked. "Secured and ready for transport." Griffin gestured toward the hallway. "Commander Ironheart awaits us in the armory. There are final preparations to be made." They walked in silence through the fortress corridors. Servants and guards they passed bowed respectfully, their expressions a mixture of hope and apprehension. Word of the impending confrontation had spread throughout the fortress, though few understood its full significance. The armory was a large chamber filled with weapons of every description, from ancient ceremonial pieces to modern practical armaments. Ironheart stood at a central table, examining a detailed map of the forest path that would lead them to the lunar glade. "The most direct route is here," he said, tracing a line with his finger. "But Shadowcrest will have wraiths watching the main approaches." "We'll take the western path," Griffin decided, indicating a more circuitous route. "Through the wolf territories. The pack can provide cover and early warning." Ironheart nodded his agreement. "I've assembled a small team of our most trusted guards, 8 warriors, all veterans who fought shadow creatures during the last wraith incursion." "No," Morgan said, surprising both men. "No guards." Griffin frowned. "We'll be outnumbered without them." "We'll be outnumbered with them," Morgan countered. "And they'll be targets. Shadowcrest needs blood for his ritual, wolf blood and moon blood. Every person we bring increases the risk that he'll obtain what he needs." She moved to the map, studying the approach to the lunar glade. "Besides, a small group can move more quietly, more quickly. The 3 of us, with the wolf pack as our allies, stand a better chance of reaching the glade undetected." Griffin and Ironheart exchanged glances. "She has a point," the old commander admitted reluctantly. "A larger force would be more easily tracked." "3 then," Griffin decided. "But I want the guards stationed here, here, and here." He indicated positions on the map. Close enough to respond if needed, far enough to avoid immediate detection. Morgan accepted the compromise with a nod. She turned her attention to the array of weapons laid out on a nearby table, specialized armaments designed specifically for combating shadow creatures. Among them was a silver bow with arrows tipped in a crystalline substance that glowed faintly blue. "Moon quartz," Ironheart explained, noting her interest, "infused with concentrated moonlight, deadly to wraiths, even at a distance." Morgan tested the bow's draw, finding it perfectly balanced for her frame and strength. "I'll take this," she decided, "and extra quivers." While Griffin and Ironheart finalized their preparations, Morgan stepped away to a quiet corner of the armory. From a pouch at her belt, she withdrew the small silver dagger her father had given her, the one that had belonged to her grandmother. She had modified it slightly overnight, etching the ritual patterns from Eleanor's scroll onto the flat of the blade. "For you, grandmother," she whispered, touching the engravings with her fingertip. "And for Mom. Today, we restore what was broken." When the final preparations were complete, they gathered in the fortress courtyard. The 3 lunar crown fragments were secured in a silver box carried by Ironheart. Morgan's locket, the 4th fragment, pulsed steadily at her throat, resonating with its separated pieces even through the container's walls. A small group of fortress guards had assembled to see them off. Their expressions were solemn, respectful. These men and women understood that what happened today would determine the future of Raven Shadow for generations to come. "Return victorious, Your Majesty," the captain of the guard said as Griffin passed. "The fortress stands ready." Griffin acknowledged him with a nod. "If we do not return by moonrise, seal the gates and prepare for siege. Shadowcrest will come for the remaining fragments." The captain bowed, fist to heart, in the traditional Raven Shadow salute. They departed through a small side gate, slipping into the forest as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Griffin led the way, moving with the assured grace of someone intimately familiar with these woods. Morgan followed, alert for any disturbance in the natural energy flow that might indicate shadow presence. Ironheart brought up the rear, his experienced eyes scanning continuously for threats. They had traveled less than a mile when the wolf pack joined them. Silverfang emerged from the underbrush first, acknowledging Morgan with a brief touch of muzzle to hand before turning to Griffin. The two communicated through some form of the bond that Morgan could sense but not fully access, a connection specific to the Wolf Crest line. After a moment, Griffin turned to his companions. "The pack reports shadow activity throughout the forest, concentrated near the lunar glade, wraiths and at least 2 shadow lords." "Shadowcrest is gathering his forces," Ironheart said grimly, "preparing for our arrival." "Or trying to prevent it," Morgan added. "He needs to complete his preparations before the full moon rises. If we can disrupt his ritual site before then, we gain the advantage." They continued through the forest, now with the wolf pack ranging around them as escorts and scouts. Through the pack bond, Morgan maintained awareness of their surroundings far beyond what normal senses would allow. She could feel the wrongness where shadow creatures had passed, cold spots in the natural energy flow, places where life force had been drained from plants and small animals. As they drew closer to the lunar glade, these disturbances became more frequent, more pronounced. Morgan's locket responded, growing warmer against her skin, its pulse quickening like a heartbeat before battle. They paused at a small stream to rest briefly and reassess their approach. Morgan knelt beside the clear water, trailing her fingers through its cool surface. Through her awakened senses, she could feel the ley line flowing beneath the streambed, a channel of natural energy that the water followed instinctively. "We're close," she said, not looking up from the water. "I can sense the convergence ahead." Griffin nodded. "The lunar glade lies just beyond that ridge. It's a natural amphitheater formed where 3 major ley lines intersect. The ancients considered it sacred ground." "Sacred ground that Shadowcrest is corrupting," Ironheart added bitterly, "using the power of convergence to fuel his ritual." Morgan rose, drying her hand on her tunic. "Then we stop him." They continued with increased caution, moving from cover to cover. The forest had grown strangely silent, no bird song, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Even the wolves moved with heightened alertness, sensing the unnatural stillness. As they approached the ridge overlooking the glade, Griffin signaled for them to drop low. They crawled the final distance, taking positions that allowed them to observe without being seen. The lunar glade spread below them, a perfect circular clearing ringed by ancient oaks. In daylight, it appeared peaceful, almost ordinary, a simple forest meadow carpeted with wildflowers. But Morgan's awakened senses revealed the truth. Beneath the surface, ley lines converged like rivers meeting, creating a nexus of natural energy that pulsed and flowed in complex patterns. At the center of the glade stood a stone altar, so old that it had become almost one with the earth around it. Upon this altar, Lord Dominic Shadowcrest worked with methodical precision, arranging objects in a complex pattern. Even from a distance, Morgan could see the two fragments of the lunar crown he possessed, one shaped like a full moon, the other like the final quarter. Wraiths patrolled this perimeter of the glade, at least a dozen of them, moving with the coordinated purpose of sentinels rather than the predatory stalking they had displayed in the forest. Two Shadow Lords supervised them, more substantial than ordinary wraiths, their forms dense with concentrated darkness. "He's nearly finished the preparations," Griffin observed in a whisper. "The pattern he's creating will channel the ley line's energy when the moon rises, amplifying his ritual." Morgan studied Shadowcrest carefully. In the full light of day, she could see him clearly for the first time. He appeared outwardly human, a tall, distinguished man with silver-streaked black hair, but there was something wrong about his movements, a fluid grace that seemed subtly inhuman. Around him, the air appeared darker, as if light itself was being absorbed into his presence. "He's become more shadow than man," Ironheart murmured. "Further gone than I feared." Morgan touched her locket, feeling its response to the fragments below. "We need to disrupt his preparations before he completes the pattern. Once it's activated, it will be much harder to counter." Griffin nodded. "We divide their attention. Ironheart, circle to the eastern approach. When you see my signal, create a distraction. Morgan and I will enter from the west, using the confusion to reach the altar." "And the wolves?" Morgan asked. "They'll engage the wraiths when we attack, keeping them occupied while we deal with Shadowcrest and his lords." The plan was simple by necessity. Too many variables remained unknown. Too many factors could change in an instant. Morgan checked her weapons one final time, ensuring easy access to both silver daggers and the moon quartz arrows. The bow was slung across her back, ready to be deployed at a moment's notice. "Remember," Griffin said as they prepared to separate, "the goal is to disrupt Shadowcrest's ritual and establish our counter-ritual. We need control of the altar and all 4 fragments together." Morgan nodded her understanding. Through the pack bond, she communicated their intent to Silverfang and the other wolves. The Silver Alpha acknowledged with a sense of determined readiness that flowed through their connection. "May the moon light your path," Ironheart said formally, clasping forearms with them in the traditional warrior's farewell. "And guide your blade," Morgan and Griffin responded in unison. They parted ways, Ironheart circling toward the eastern approach, while Morgan and Griffin made their way westward, keeping low among the underbrush. The wolf pack split as well, positioning themselves strategically around the glade's perimeter. As they neared the western edge of the clearing, Morgan could feel the ley line's energy growing stronger, more chaotic. Shadowcrest's work was affecting the natural flow, creating distortions that rippled outward from the central altar. Griffin paused at the edge of the tree line, his hand on Morgan's arm. "Wait for Ironheart's distraction. When it comes, we move directly for the altar. Stay close to me." Morgan adjusted the quiver at her hip and loosened her daggers in their sheaths. Her heart beat steadily, neither racing nor faltering. The familiar calm of impending battle had settled over her. The focused state she had known during her military service, now enhanced by the awakened power flowing through her veins. They didn't have to wait long. A sudden commotion erupted from the eastern edge of the glade. Flames burst upward, silver blue and unnaturally bright, accompanied by a sound like breaking glass. The wraiths nearest the disturbance scattered in momentary confusion, and one of the Shadow Lords moved quickly toward the source. "Now!" Griffin commanded. They burst from cover, sprinting across the open ground toward the central altar. The wolf pack emerged simultaneously from multiple points around the glade's perimeter, engaging the wraiths with coordinated precision. Silverfang led the charge, its powerful form a blur of silver fur as it tackled a wraith that moved to intercept Morgan. Shadowcrest's head snapped up at the commotion, his eyes widening as he spotted Griffin and Morgan advancing. For a moment, his aristocratic features registered genuine surprise. Then his expression hardened into calculated determination. "Wolfcrest!" he called, his voice carrying effortlessly across the glade. "I wondered when you'd make your appearance." His gaze shifted to Morgan, cold assessment in his eyes. "And you've brought the last Silverblood. How convenient." He gestured sharply, and the remaining Shadow Lord moved to intercept them, its form expanding and darkening as it drew power from the ley lines beneath the glade. The wraiths that weren't engaged with the wolves changed course, converging on Griffin and Morgan with unnatural speed. Morgan knocked a moon quartz arrow and let it fly in one fluid motion. The crystalline tip blazed with silver light as it streaked toward the approaching Shadow Lord. It struck the creature's center mass, embedding deeply in the concentrated darkness. The Shadow Lord writhed, its form temporarily destabilized by the infusion of opposing energy. Griffin took advantage of the opening, charging past the incapacitated Lord toward Shadowcrest. Morgan followed closely, firing another arrow at a wraith that tried to flank them. The arrow struck true, causing the wraith to dissolve with a keening wail. They were halfway to the altar when Shadowcrest made his countermove. Raising both hands, he channeled shadow energy into the incomplete ritual pattern, causing it to flare with dark purple light. The ley lines beneath the glade responded, their natural flow momentarily disrupted. The effect was immediate. Morgan felt as if she were suddenly moving through deep water, her movements slowed by some invisible resistance. Griffin experienced the same, his advance reduced to a labored push against the distorted energy field. "He's using the ley lines against us," Griffin growled, fighting to maintain forward momentum, drawing on the shadow aspect of the convergence. Morgan reached for her locket, focusing on its connection to the other fragments. If Shadowcrest could manipulate one aspect of the ley lines, perhaps she could counter with another. Concentrating on the moon energy flowing through her blood, she channeled it into the locket, which blazed in response. The resistance lessened around them as moon energy pushed back against shadow, creating a corridor of balanced force through which they could move more freely. They resumed their advance, now only yards from the altar where Shadowcrest waited, his hands still raised in continuation of his working. "The wolf and the moon, coming together as planned," Shadowcrest said, his voice unnervingly calm, despite the chaos surrounding him. "You think you've come to stop me, but you're merely fulfilling your roles in a script written centuries ago." He stepped away from the altar, revealing the completed pattern he had created, a complex arrangement of symbols and objects with the two lunar crown fragments positioned at critical junction points. The pattern pulsed with a mixture of energies, shadow predominant, but with elements of wolf and moon woven through it, corrupted, twisted, but undeniably present. "The three founding powers, united once more," Shadowcrest continued, "but this time under a single will, mine." "That was never the intention," Griffin replied, his voice steady despite the exertion of resisting the energy field. "The three powers were meant to balance each other, not merge under one control." Shadowcrest's lip curled in disdain. "Balance is stagnation. Evolution requires dominance, selection of the strongest aspect." While Griffin kept Shadowcrest's attention, Morgan assessed the ritual pattern. Her grandmother's teachings, accessed through the awakened locket, allowed her to recognize the perversion of what should have been a harmonious design. Shadowcrest had created a funnel, essentially, a structure that would draw the powers of wolf and moon into the shadow aspect when activated by the full moon's light. She needed to disrupt it, to break the pattern before it could be fully energized. but simply destroying it might release the accumulated energy in unpredictable ways, potentially catastrophic for all of Ravenshadow. Instead, she would need to transform it, to convert Shadowcrest's corrupted design into the balanced configuration from her grandmother's counter-ritual. As this realization crystallized, the battle around them intensified. The wolves had engaged the majority of the wraiths, their physical forms proving surprisingly effective against the shadow creatures when enhanced by the pack bond's connection to Morgan's moon energy. Through the bond, she could sense their coordinated attacks, feel the satisfaction when a wraith dissolved under their assault. Ironheart had rejoined the fight, his silver sword flashing as he cut through wraiths with the efficiency of long experience. He was making his way toward them, providing cover as they confronted Shadowcrest. The Shadow Lord that Morgan had temporarily disabled with her arrow had recovered and now moved to protect its master, placing itself between them and the altar. Griffin drew his sword, the silver blade gleaming in the midday sun. "Keep Shadowcrest occupied," Morgan told him, unslinging her bow. "I need to reach the altar to transform the pattern." Griffin nodded his understanding, then launched himself at the Shadow Lord with supernatural speed. His sword struck the creature's form, silver light flaring where metal met darkness. The Shadow Lord retaliated with tendrils of condensed shadow that whipped toward Griffin's face and throat. Morgan circled wide, seeking an opening to the altar while Griffin engaged the Shadow Lord. Shadowcrest tracked her movement, his eyes narrowing as he discerned her intent. "The last Silverblood," he said, his voice taking on a hypnotic quality. "You don't even understand what you are, what power runs in your veins. Your grandmother knew. Your mother, too, before I ended her interference." Morgan faltered slightly at the casual admission of her mother's murder, a spike of rage momentarily disrupting her focus. Shadowcrest smiled coldly, seeing the effect of his words. "She fought well, your mother, but in the end, she fell like all the others, as you will fall today." With a gesture that seemed almost lazy, Shadowcrest sent a wave of shadow energy rolling toward Morgan. Unlike the crude attacks of wraiths, this was focused, precise, a blade of pure darkness aimed at severing her connection to the moon energy she channeled. Morgan raised her locket instinctively, focusing her will through the fragment of the lunar crown. It responded instantly, blazing with silver light that met the shadow blade in midair. The two forces clashed, creating a momentary stalemate as darkness pushed against light. Using the distraction, Morgan fired a moon quartz arrow directly at Shadowcrest. He deflected it with another gesture, but the effort cost him concentration on his shadow attack. The stalemate broke in Morgan's favor, allowing her to advance closer to the altar. Griffin was fully engaged with the Shadow Lord, their combat a blur of silver blade and darkness. Though the creature was powerful, Griffin fought with the strength and speed of his bloodline, his movements fluid and precise. Through their bond, Morgan could sense him drawing on his wolf aspect, enhancing his human form with primal power. Ironheart had cleared a path through the wraiths and now moved to support Griffin, his silver sword joining the attack on the Shadow Lord. Together, they drove the creature back, creating space for Morgan to reach the altar. She sprinted forward, holstering her bow and drawing her silver daggers as she ran. Shadowcrest sent another attack her way, a swarm of shadow projectiles that whistled through the air like deadly arrows. Morgan deflected what she could with her daggers, accepting glancing blows from others that left cold burns on her exposed skin. Reaching the altar, she immediately began to work, using her daggers to modify Shadowcrest's pattern. She traced new lines in the accumulated energy, redirecting flows, changing angles, transforming the funnel design into the balanced triad from her grandmother's scroll. The two lunar crown fragments on the altar responded to her touch, their energy signature shifting from predominantly shadow to a more harmonious mixture as she adjusted their positions. "Stop her!" Shadowcrest commanded, genuine alarm entering his voice for the first time. The Shadow Lord broke away from its engagement with Griffin and Ironheart, lunging toward the altar with desperate speed. Griffin intercepted it with a flying tackle that would have been impossible for a normal human, driving the creature to the ground several yards from where Morgan worked. Shadowcrest himself advanced on Morgan, shadows gathering around his hands like living gauntlets. "You cannot undo what has taken centuries to create," he snarled, his aristocratic mask slipping to reveal the monster beneath. "The shadow ascendancy is inevitable." Morgan didn't pause in her work, her hands moving with the confidence of ancestral memory as she continued to transform the ritual pattern. "Nothing is inevitable," she replied, her voice steady despite the danger advancing toward her. "Balance can be restored." She removed her locket, placing it in the center of the transformed pattern. The 4 fragments of the lunar crown, her crescent and shadow crest's full and quarter pieces, plus the new moon fragment from the fortress, now formed a complete circuit. They began to glow with increasing intensity, resonating with each other as their connection strengthened. Shadowcrest reached the altar, his shadow-wreathed hands extending toward Morgan. "Blood of the moon," he intoned, his voice taking on a ritualistic cadence. "Freely given or forcibly taken." Before he could complete the gesture, Silverfang burst from the ongoing battle, its powerful form launching into Shadowcrest with the full force of its momentum. The impact sent them both tumbling away from the altar, buying Morgan precious seconds to complete her work. The transformed pattern was nearly complete. Following her grandmother's design, Morgan used her ceremonial dagger to add the final element. A small amount of her own blood, freely given, placed at the pattern's center point where all energies converged. "Blood of the moon," she echoed Shadowcrest's words, but with a different inflection, a different intent. "Freely given for balance, not dominance." The effect was immediate and dramatic. The 4 fragments of the lunar crown blazed with silver fire, their combined light illuminating the entire glade with a radiance that caused the remaining wraiths to shriek and recoil. The ley lines beneath the earth responded, their flow shifting from the distorted pattern Shadowcrest had imposed back toward their natural harmony. Shadowcrest had regained his feet, throwing off Silverfang with a burst of shadow energy that sent the wolf tumbling. His face contorted with rage and disbelief as he saw what Morgan had accomplished. "No!" he howled, lunging toward the altar with inhuman speed. Griffin intercepted him, his sword flashing in a silver arc that forced Shadowcrest to defend rather than attack. The two circled each other, primal power facing corrupted shadow in a confrontation that had been brewing for generations. "It's over, Dominic," Griffin said, his voice carrying the authority of his bloodline. "The balance is restoring. You can still return to your original purpose, still be healed." "Healed?" Shadowcrest spat the word like poison. "I am not ill, Wolfcrest. I am evolved, the next stage in Ravenshadow's development, and I will not be denied." With a gesture of concentrated will, Shadowcrest sent a massive surge of shadow energy directly at Griffin, not an attack on his body, but on the wolf bond at the core of his being. Griffin staggered under the assault, his connection to his primal aspect temporarily disrupted. Shadowcrest used the moment to lunge past him toward the altar where Morgan stood with the activated pattern. But Ironheart was there, placing himself between Shadowcrest and his target. The old commander's silver sword met Shadowcrest's shadow attack, deflecting it with the skill of decades of combat experience. "You will not touch her," Ironheart declared, his weathered face set with determination. "Old fool," Shadowcrest snarled. "You've stood in my way once too often." What followed was a blur of silver and shadow as the two engaged in combat, Ironheart's masterful swordsmanship against Shadowcrest's corrupted power. For a moment, it seemed the old warrior might prevail through sheer skill and determination. But Shadowcrest had the advantage of the shadow energy he had been accumulating for decades. With a gesture that seemed almost casual, he sent a blade of pure darkness through Ironheart's defenses. The commander gasped as it pierced his chest, his silver sword falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. "No!" Griffin's anguished cry tore through the glade as he witnessed his mentor and friend fall. Morgan felt the commander's death like a physical blow, but she couldn't abandon her position at the altar. The counter-ritual was at a critical juncture, requiring her constant attention to guide the rebalancing energies. Griffin's grief transformed instantly to fury. With a roar that was more wolf than human, he charged Shadowcrest. The two collided in an explosion of primal energy, the force of their impact creating a shockwave that rippled across the glade. Through the pack bond, Morgan sensed Griffin drawing deeply on his wolf aspect, pushing the limits of his partial transformation. His eyes blazed silver gray, his movements became more fluid, his strength multiplied as he drove Shadowcrest back from the altar and the fallen Ironheart. The counter-ritual continued to gain momentum, the 4 fragments of the lunar crown now spinning in a perfect circle above the altar, creating a miniature replica of the original crown. The light they emitted grew steadily brighter, pushing back the shadow energy that Shadowcrest had accumulated. Morgan maintained her focus, guiding the process despite the battle raging around her. Through the locket's connection, she could feel the crown recognizing her bloodline, responding to her intent to restore rather than dominate. Shadowcrest and Griffin fought with increasing ferocity, each drawing deeply on their respective powers. The ground beneath them cracked as leyline energy responded to their conflict, darkness and primal force clashing in concentrated bursts. Then, Shadowcrest made a tactical error. In his desperation to reach the altar and disrupt the counter-ritual, he left himself momentarily exposed. Griffin seized the opportunity, driving his silver sword through Shadowcrest's defenses and into his shoulder. Shadowcrest screamed, a sound of rage more than pain, as the silver disrupted his connection to the shadow energy he wielded. He staggered backward, momentarily vulnerable, his control slipping. This was the moment Morgan had been waiting for. With the counter-ritual reaching its climax, she channeled her will through the reconstructed lunar crown, directing its combined power not to destroy Shadowcrest, but to cleanse him, to burn away the corruption of centuries and restore the original balance. A beam of pure silver light shot from the spinning crown, enveloping Shadowcrest in radiance. He screamed again, this time in genuine agony, as the light penetrated his being, separating shadow from man, corruption from original purpose. The process was neither gentle nor kind, but it was necessary. The light intensified, becoming almost unbearable to look at directly. Within its radiance, Shadowcrest's form seemed to split, dividing into 2 distinct entities, a human figure and a mass of writhing darkness. As the separation completed, the human form collapsed to the ground, unconscious but alive. The darkness, now without a host to anchor it, attempted to flee, to dissipate into the surrounding forest. But the counter-ritual had prepared for this eventuality. The spinning crown fragments emitted a pulse of energy that formed a containing pattern around the escaped darkness, preventing its escape. The pattern contracted gradually, compressing the shadow energy, forcing it back into its original nature, not the corrupted, life-draining force it had become, but the pure essence of shadow as it had been at Ravenshadow's founding. A keeper of secrets, a guardian of mysteries, a necessary counterbalance to wolf and moon. With a final flash of silver light, the transformation completed. Where the mass of corrupted shadow had been, there now hovered a perfect orb of darkness, contained, purified, restored to its original purpose. The spinning fragments of the lunar crown slowed their rotation and descended gently back to the altar. The counter-ritual was complete. Throughout the glade, the remaining wraiths dissolved as their connection to corrupted shadow energy was severed. The Shadow Lord fighting the wolves dissipated with a wail that seemed to carry both rage and relief. Morgan sagged against the altar, suddenly exhausted. The channeling of so much energy, the precision required to guide the counter-ritual to its conclusion, had drained her nearly to the limit of her endurance. Griffin approached slowly, sheathing his silver sword. His features had returned fully to human form, though his eyes still held the wild gleam of his wolf aspect. He looked first to Ironheart's fallen form, grief evident in the set of his shoulders. Then he turned to Morgan, concern replacing sorrow as he noted her exhaustion. "It's done," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. Griffin nodded, surveying the aftermath of their confrontation. "Not as we expected, perhaps, but done nonetheless." The wolf pack had gathered around them, Silverfang at their center. Through the bond, Morgan sensed their mixture of triumph and wariness. The battle was won, but something fundamental had changed in Ravenshadow. The balance that had been disrupted for generations was restoring.
but in a new configuration that none could fully predict. Morgan pushed herself upright, gathering the 4 fragments of the lunar crown. They no longer spun or blazed with silver fire, but a subtle luminescence remained, evidence of their awakened state. "What happens now?" she asked, looking from the fragments to the unconscious form of Dominic Shadowcrest, then to the orb of purified shadow that hovered nearby. Griffin moved to kneel beside Ironheart, closing the old commander's eyes with gentle fingers. "We rebuild," he said after a moment of silence. "We restore the threefold balance properly this time, with full understanding of its purpose." He rose, facing Morgan squarely. "The Wolfcrest line remains to guide with strength and justice. The Silverblood line, your line, returns to its role of healing and protection. And the Shadowcrest gift, purified now, must find a new worthy bearer." Morgan looked at the orb of darkness, understanding dawning. Not Dominic. No, he betrayed his purpose, corrupted his gift. He will live, but as an ordinary man, stripped of shadow power. Griffin gestured to the orb. "This must be entrusted to someone who understands its true nature, its proper role in the balance." The wolves had begun to withdraw, returning to the forest now that the threat had passed. Only Silverfang remained, watching the proceedings with intelligent eyes. Through their bond, Morgan sensed its approval of what had been accomplished, and what remained to be done. She gathered the 4 fragments of the lunar crown, feeling their connection to her bloodline. "These should be reunited properly," she said, "restored as they were meant to be, not as weapons or tools of power, but as symbols of the balance." Griffin nodded his agreement. "The crown belongs to the Moon Guardian line, to you now. Use it wisely as your grandmother would have." Morgan looked around the lunar glade, at the altar where ancient powers had clashed and found new equilibrium, at the fallen form of Commander Ironheart, who had given his life to protect the balance, at the unconscious Shadowcrest, now stripped of his corrupted gift, at the purified orb of darkness, awaiting a worthy bearer. Finally, her eyes returned to Griffin, the Wolf King, who had recognized her heritage and guided her awakening. "Raven Shadow begins anew today," she said, straightening despite her exhaustion. 3 powers in proper balance, as was always intended. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the glade. Soon, the full moon would rise, not as the catalyst for domination that Shadowcrest had planned, but as witness to restored harmony. Morgan Silverblood, the last Moon Guardian, clasped the fragments of her heritage and looked to the future that they would build from the ashes of ancient conflict. Balance had been restored, but maintaining it would be the work of generations to come. With the wolf pack as their escort and the purified shadow safely contained, they began the journey back to Wolfcrest Fortress, carrying with them the body of their fallen comrade and the unconscious form of their former enemy. Behind them, the lunar glade pulsed with renewed energy as the ley lines resumed their natural flow, balanced once more between the 3 founding powers of Raven Shadow. The ritual of the Moon Shard was complete.